On nights like this, where the wind drifts without direction, and the dark has a kind of weight to it, you and I become the only two people awake in a world that has quietly decided to sleep without us. Maybe you're listening from a small apartment somewhere between two tired city blocks. Maybe you're out on the road, driving a little too late, the radio holding you company the way a porch light holds back a field of shadows. Or maybe you're already in bed, lying very still, trying to let the hum of the night settle your breathing. Wherever you are, welcome. You've tuned into a place meant for the restless, a place for insomniacs, night shifters, wanderers, and anyone who's ever felt the strange comfort of being awake while everyone else isn't. Tonight, we're taking a long walk into the remote corners of the world, 5 places too far from help, too quiet for comfort, and too old to truly forget what came before us. These are stories of isolation, of geography that works against you, of the way sound travels differently when you're the only living thing for miles. They're not violent stories, not bloody ones, but they linger. They stay under the skin. They wait for you in that soft space between waking and sleep. So, take a breath. Settle in. Let the dark around you stretch just a little further, because the first story tonight begins on a frozen stretch of farmland where winter has teeth, and the silence carries a pulse of its own, something older than the house, older than the land, something that only wakes on the longest night of the year. I arrived at the Solstice Farm on the kind of December afternoon that doesn't feel like a time of day at all, just a pale, suspended hour where the sky hangs low enough to press on the roof of your truck and the cold settles into your bones like it's found a permanent home there. The road leading in wasn't a real road anymore, more of a long indentation carved between waist-high drifts and rows of skeletal fence posts whose wires sagged under years of indifferent winters. For miles in every direction, all I saw were empty fields sealed beneath sheets of wind-carved snow, with darker bands of frozen earth exposed where the wind had scraped the land bare. It was the kind of landscape that swallowed sound, leaving only the whisper of the engine and the faint creak of ice forming and reforming on the windshield. The farmhouse looked smaller than it had in the photos, older too, leaning slightly toward the west like it had grown tired of fighting the wind. The place belonged to an older couple who spent most winters down in Arizona, leaving someone like me to check the pipes, maintain the generator, and keep the place from sinking entirely into neglect and frost. I'd taken jobs like this before, in places scattered across Montana, Idaho, the Dakotas, lonely winter caretaker positions that paid well precisely because most people didn't want to be out in the hinterlands when the world went white and the night stretched 12, 13 hours long. But something about this farm was different from the moment I stepped out of the truck. The wind cutting across the fields with a low, drawn-out hum, not loud, not soft, just present, as if the land itself was exhaling. When I met the owner a week earlier, a wiry man named Clifford with a bristly gray beard and a manner that suggested he was always halfway through an unfinished thought, he'd given me the rundown of the place, where the buried lines were, which doors stuck in the cold, how the generator liked to stall when the temperature dipped below 10 degrees, where the emergency kerosene was stored. All the practical details. Then, just as we were wrapping up, he'd paused, glancing at the frost gathering along the edge of the barn windows, and said with a firmness that hadn't been in his voice before, "Whatever you do, son, don't turn on the outdoor floodlights on the night of the winter solstice." He said it plain, without theatrics, without the sly smile of someone passing on an old local superstition. If anything, the way he avoided looking at me made it feel like a warning he didn't want to give but felt obligated to. And I'd laughed at first, thinking he meant something like the wiring was faulty or the lights attracted animals, but he'd shaken his head, his jaw tightening. "Just leave them off. The solstice is the longest night of the year. The lights only make things worse." Well, I nearly asked him what he meant by worse, but he'd already turned away, muttering something about beating the early snowstorm on his drive out of town. The conversation felt unfinished, in a way that crawled back up my spine now as I unlocked the farmhouse door and stepped inside, the stale scent of wood smoke and cold air wrapping around me like a held breath. Inside, the house was simple, all dark wooden floors and wide windows that stared out across the endless white. The furniture sat under thin sheets like ghosts, waiting for permission to rise. I dropped my bag by the door and walked through slowly, listening to the quiet. Houses in winter always have a voice, settling beams, rattling vents, the occasional pop of contracting wood, but this place was still in a way that felt intentional, like it was listening as much as I was. By the time evening began to compress the light into bruised shades of blue, I had the generator running, the radiators ticking with warmth, and a pot of coffee simmering on the stove. Outside the windows, the world blurred into a single, continuous sweep of snow and sky. No distant farmhouses, no headlights on the horizon, no movement except for the shifting wind carving spirals into the drifts. I'd been alone in remote places many times, but here, solitude felt like a thing with weight and shape, like a presence leaning against the walls. It was near midnight when I first noticed it. The faintest tremor in the air. Not a sound. Not exactly. More like the memory of a sound. The suggestion that something was resonating just beyond the reach of hearing. I stood up, listening harder, my hand still wrapped around the warm ceramic mug. The vibration seemed to come from beneath the floorboards, spreading upward in a thin, steady pulse that made the fine hair along my arms lift. At first I assumed it was the generator, a loose panel, maybe, or the vibration of ice collecting around the housing. But when I stepped outside into the brittle night air to check, the generator's rumble was steady and predictable, grounded in the reassuring mechanical rhythm I'd grown familiar with. The strange resonance I'd felt inside was gone out here. All that reached me now was the wind skimming across the fields and the soft creak of the barn siding shifting in the cold. I lingered on the porch a moment longer, my breath drifting in pale ribbons before vanishing into the dark. Across the field, silhouetted against the dim sky, stood the old stone circle, 12 weather-worn stones arranged in a ring no taller than my waist, each one slanted at a slightly different angle, as if they'd been placed with intention. Clifford had mentioned it once, offhandedly, saying it wasn't really a circle so much as an old marker, but he hadn't elaborated. I'd assumed it was some remnant of pioneer days, maybe a foundation outline or the ruins of a storage pen. But now, in the moonlit hush, the stones looked older, much older, set into the earth with too much deliberation for something purely functional. As I looked at them, a faint impression moved along my skin again. A pressure, a low static hum, almost like the air within the ring was vibrating even from this distance. I shook off the unease and stepped back inside, closing the door quickly to block the cold. Throughout the night, the feeling came and went, rising beneath the floorboards like the swell of a quiet tide. Nothing overtly alarming, nothing that could be pinned to any clear source, but enough to keep my mind alert, hovering on the edge of sleep without ever falling into it completely. I sat in a rocking chair near the window, wrapped in a wool blanket, watching the empty expanse of white. Occasionally, the wind shifted in such a way that it carried with it the impression of movement, like figures drifting at the edge of the fields, too far away and too shapeless to be anything more than tricks of the eyes. But there was one moment, just before dawn, when I could have sworn I saw a dark silhouette standing near the stone circle. A trick of the moonlight, I told myself. A shrub, a fence post, the shadowed curvature of a drift. Yet the shape had that very particular stillness of something watching. By morning, the world had softened under a new layer of snow, and the stones were half hidden once more. The uneasy vibrational pulse from the night before had faded into memory, leaving me to question whether it had been nothing more than the adjustment phase of settling into a new place, the earliest hints of isolation pressing in. Still, when I walked out to check the property line that afternoon, just routine, just habit, I felt that subtle shift again in the air as I approached the stone circle. Not a sound, not warmth, not cold, not anything identifiable, just a sensation, diffuse and insistent, like a low frequency pressing behind the eyes. I stood there for a long moment, the snow crackling softly beneath my boots, and wondered, as the wind swept through the stones in a single long breath, why Clifford had cared so much about the floodlights on the solstice night, and why, for the first time since taking the job, I found myself wishing that night was much further away. If the first night on the solstice farm had felt like a gentle warning from the land, subtle, ambiguous, the kind of unease you could still explain to yourself with enough rational thought, then the second night began to peel away those rational layers one by one, until I felt as if I were walking through a place that existed just slightly out of sync with the world I'd always known. The day after my walk to the stone circle passed almost too quietly. Snow drifted sideways across the fields in long ribbons, the kind that lift from the ground as if the earth itself were breathing out through clenched teeth. The wind pressed against the windows in steady, rhythmic surges, not violent, not chaotic, but deliberate, like a large hand testing the frame of the house. I tried to distract myself with routine tasks, checking the pipes beneath the kitchen sink, sweeping the back porch, clearing a few inches of powder from the path to the barn. Normal caretaker duties, normal winter tasks, but normality never settled inside me. Not fully. Whenever I paused, hand on the broom handle, fingers resting against the cold metal latch of the barn door, eyes drifting toward the edge of the field, I sensed it again. That subtle, internal resonance, a faint humming in the bones rather than the ears. It rose and fell with no obvious pattern, threading itself through the quiet like a second pulse. At first it was easy enough to ignore, the way you ignore a distant engine or a faraway train. But by late afternoon, as the daylight thinned into long gray strands stretching toward the horizon, the hum felt closer, more insistent, as if the whole property was breathing in a frequency I wasn't meant to hear. Around dusk, I ventured back inside the house, taking refuge in the muted warmth of the radiators. The wooden floors creaked under my steps, and the air smelled faintly of old wool and pine smoke. I made myself dinner, just a bowl of reheated stew left in the freezer by the owners and aided by the living room window, the fog from my breath gathering faintly on the glass. The stone circle sat half hidden under the snow, but its outline remained visible, a ring of deeper shadow pressing through the whiteness. Every so often, the wind carried a low, sweeping sound across the field, like a hand brushing over a drumhead, and each time it passed, I felt the hum inside me shift. I tried to shake it off, tried to remind myself that isolation can play tricks on the senses. You spend too many hours in a silent place, the mind starts to fill in the quiet with its own inventions. But even that comforting logic faltered as night deepened and the temperature fell. The farmhouse seemed to expand and contract with the cold, the walls settling in slow groans, the windows temperamentally rattling in their frames. Yet beneath those natural sounds, the hum persisted, steady, patient, like something waiting to be acknowledged. It was sometime after 9 when I first noticed the peculiar behavior of the lights. I was in the hallway, passing by the row of old photographs Clifford and his wife had left hanging on the wall, grainy snapshots of the farm in different decades, the land stretching out exactly as it did now, season after season, unchanged, except for the aging appearances of the people in the pictures when the overhead bulb flickered. Not a quick, mechanical flicker, but a slow, almost languid dimming, as if someone were turning a dial with great care. The light thinned, drained to a dull ember, then drifted back to full brightness in a way that felt too intentional to be electrical. I stood still under the bulb, listening. The hum rose behind my ribs, a faint throb, a whisper of a thought slid through me. Irrational, unwelcome, but persistent. It's adjusting to you. I shook my head hard, exhaling a long breath as I forced myself to move again. The light stabilized. Nothing else seemed out of place. Yet the moment lingered behind me like a hand brushing the back of my neck. Outside, night smothered the fields in deep blue, the kind of blue that feels hours older than black. Snow grains skittered across the window, glass in sharp little rasps. I tried turning on the radio for company, an old battery-powered thing that probably hadn't been tuned since the previous winter, but no matter what frequency I dialed to, all I heard was static. Not hissing static, but a low, padded static, soft and strangely melodic, as though the radio wasn't receiving interference, but listening to something, leaning closer to it. I couldn't shake the sense that the static had depth, layers, almost like voices. Not words. No, nothing as clear as that. More like collective breathing, the rhythmic swell of many people inhaling slowly, exhaling slower, together. That unsettled me more than anything that had happened so far, and I switched the radio off. By 10, the hum had grown more noticeable, though never loud. It remained felt rather than heard, a compression of air inside the chest and sinuses, like what you experience before a storm breaks or when standing near a large engine without the actual sound to accompany the vibration. I walked from room to room, trying to pinpoint its source, but the sensation followed me with exact neutrality, no stronger in the kitchen than in the living room, no softer by the stairs. Whatever it wasn't coming from any one place. It was everywhere, evenly distributed, woven seamlessly into the environment. It was only when I stood at the back door, hand resting on the cold brass knob, that I realized the hum grew slightly sharper when I looked toward the fields. For 10 minutes I stood there, staring out into the vast night. The moon hung low, its light smeared by passing clouds, and across the field, at the location of the stone circle, the snow shifted oddly subtle currents rising and falling as though the ground beneath it pulsed. I blinked hard, trying to clear the impression, but the movement persisted, gentle and rhythmic, like breath. A swell of uneasiness pushed me back from the door. I forced a laugh under my breath, though it came out thin. Isolation, I muttered. That's all this is. But the hum disagreed. It swelled again, more insistent, and suddenly I felt as though the farmhouse wasn't keeping something out but barely holding something in. That thought made the back of my neck prickle with heat. I decided to retreat upstairs, hoping that distance and altitude might provide some psychological buffer. The staircase creaked beneath my weight, each step sounding oddly muffled, as if swallowed by the thickening air. At the top, the small bedrooms branched off in neat symmetry. I chose the room facing the fields. I don't know why. Perhaps part of me wanted to confront whatever impression had threaded itself through my mind before it grew worse in the night. I drew back the curtains and looked out once more. The stone circle was unmistakably darker than the surrounding snow now. A faint depression seemed to radiate outward from it, like a shallow basin carved by years of invisible pressure. The shadows inside the ring appeared denser, inkier, almost liquid in the way they merged with the night. And then just for a moment something shifted within that darkness. Not a figure, not movement in the conventional sense, more like a distortion, as if the air inside the circle rippled, pushing outward in a brief, expanding wave that made the moonlight bend. My breath hitched. A thin line of condensation formed on the inside of the window pane. The hum inside me tightened. I realized then that the sensation wasn't random. It wasn't meaningless. It responded. When my attention moved toward the circle, the hum deepened. When I turned away, the hum softened, but never vanished. It was interactive. A call, and my awareness was the answer. I backed away from the window slowly, the wooden floor cold even through my socks. The house seemed to constrict with me, the shadows gathering in the corners like held breath. I crawled into bed, fully clothed, pulling the blanket up to my chin, listening intently to the silence. The hum continued, softer now, but undeniably present. A steady, low vibration threading itself through my bones. I lay awake for hours, tracing the rhythm of my pulse, trying to convince myself that the sensation was nothing more than fatigue, or the generator rumbling through the frozen ground, or the natural acoustics of old wood settling. But sometime past 3 in the morning, my eyes snapped open, because for the first time since arriving, I heard something layered beneath the hum. Not words, not voices, but a pitch, high, thin, impossible, and impossibly familiar, like the distant, stretched sound of human breath drawn through a very narrow space, multiplied hundreds of times, woven together in an impossible harmony too faint to exist, a harmony that rose from the fields, right where the stone circle lay. And even though the solstice hadn't yet arrived, I felt deep in the pressure behind my ears that whatever waited out there had begun to wake early. I woke the next morning with the distinct sense that I had slept inside someone else's dream. One of those fragile, translucent dreams where the edges blur the moment you open your eyes. Yet something lingers, a residue of emotion without memory. The room around me was pale with early light, the frost etched across the window like thin veins branching outward from a frozen heart. For a moment, I lay completely still, listening. The hum had stopped, or rather, It had retreated, buried deep beneath consciousness like a low animal crouching in sleep. The sudden absence felt wrong, almost dizzying, the way silence feels after hours of constant engine noise. I pushed myself upright slowly, waiting for the vibration in my chest to return, but the air remained still, slack, almost too quiet. Downstairs, the house looked exactly the same as it had the night before, yet something in its arrangement felt subtly rearranged, like a stage reset between acts. The rocking chair faced a slightly different angle. The kitchen towel lay folded on the counter rather than draped over the sink. My boots, placed neatly by the door, seemed to have been nudged closer together. These were small things, trivial things I could easily blame on my own fatigue, my own poor memory. But the way my skin prickled as I walked into the kitchen slowly, carefully, made me feel as though the house disagreed. It had been watching, or waiting. A thin band of sunlight stretched across the floorboards, pale and watery, as if the sun itself struggled to break through the winter air. I brewed coffee, trying to ground myself in simple motions. Scoop, pour, heat, inhale. The steam rose in soft spirals. For the briefest moment, I felt normal again, anchored. Then I saw the footprints. They were faint, almost imperceptible impressions in the thin layer of snow on the back porch, shallow ovals leading from the edge of the fields to the porch steps, and stopping there, as if whoever or whatever had left them had simply decided that was far enough. The prints were smooth, lacking tread, lacking detail. No lines, no ridges, just rounded depressions, too wide to be human, too narrow to be anything else. Their spacing was odd, too even, too deliberate. Each print the exact same distance apart. I opened the back door slowly, cold air pouring over my ankles. Outside, the world was motionless. The wind had died, leaving the snow surface polished and still, as if the land were holding its breath. I crouched beside the nearest print. The edges were crisp, meaning they were new left sometime in the hours after I'd fallen asleep. The depression wasn't deep, only enough to disturb the snow's surface. I ran a gloved finger around its perimeter. The snow hadn't melted, which meant whatever made the print wasn't warm. But the shape was wrong for an animal, wrong for boots, wrong for anything I could name. A sudden pressure bloomed behind my ears, brief, sharp, like the pop you feel when descending in a plane. I froze, breath catching in my throat. The hum had returned, faint but undeniable, threading itself into the base of my skull as if responding to my attention. I stood up too quickly, the blood rushing from my head. The fields lay open and featureless. The stone circle sat buried again, only its upper edges visible above the drifts. The stones glistening slightly in the morning light. Just snow settling, I told myself. Just the natural shift of frozen ground. But the prints remained, and there were no return tracks leading away. Whatever had come toward the porch had not left. I backed into the house, closing the door with more force than necessary, the sound echoing in the hollow winter quiet. All day, the unease settled around me like a second coat. I tried to keep busy checking the basement pipes for cracks, reloading the wood stove, tightening a loose hinge on the mudroom door, but every few minutes, my eyes drifted toward the windows, toward the field, toward the circle, and every time I looked, I felt something in the air tighten, subtle as a breath drawn in. By early afternoon, I decided to check the generator again, convincing myself that tangible tasks would keep my mind from straying into speculation. I bundled up, stepped outside, and trudged through the snow toward the small metal shed housing the machinery. The wind had picked up again, moving in long, low sweeps across the land, the kind of wind that carries weight rather than sound. As I passed the barn, something caught my eye. Along its outer wall, just above the snow line, thin vertical streaks of frost had formed parallel lines, spaced evenly, each one pale as bone against the wood. I brushed a glove against one, expecting it to crumble, but the line remained intact, its texture faintly ridged, like the impression of something pressed against the barn's siding during the night. There were dozens of them, rising in uniform paths from ground to window height like fingers or ribs. A chill slicked down my spine, colder than the winter air. Inside the generator shed, The familiar thrum of the engine greeted me. But as I leaned closer, checking the gauges, I realized the rhythm of the generator didn't match the hum inside my body. The two vibrations coexisted, but they weren't related. If anything, they seemed to compete, each pulse interrupting the other in irregular intervals, like overlapping heartbeats. I returned to the house with a growing sense of dread. Dread that didn't come from fear of what I might find, but fear of what I might confirm. By late afternoon, the wind shifted again, picking up fragments of snow and tossing them into curling, looping shapes that danced across the yard. The air felt charged, metallic, like the static before lightning. I stood at the living room window, staring toward the stone circle. The snow there moved differently. While the rest of the field rippled under the wind, the snow within the circle seemed to swirl inward, as if drawn toward a single point. Small eddies spiraled, eroding the surface layer until the tops of the stones emerged fully again. The stones looked darker now, saturated with moisture that hadn't been there moments earlier. And though I was too far away to truly see, I felt deep in the vibrating pressure behind my eyes that something beneath the snow was shifting, rising, preparing. As twilight bled slowly into the edges of the land, the hum gathered strength. Not loud, not immediate, but unavoidable, like a second pulse layered under my own. My vision faltered at the edges, warping slightly when I looked too long at the horizon, and then the sky dimmed abruptly, as if a cloud had passed over the sun. But there was no cloud. The stone circle darkened. A single ripple passed across the snow. The hum deepened. I staggered back from the window, heart tripping over itself. It wasn't sound. It wasn't vibration. It was attention, focused, directed, deliberate. The realization hit with cold clarity. Whatever lay beneath that field was not merely waking for the solstice. It was turning toward me, and the snow, ancient and silent, remembered every footstep that had ever dared cross its threshold. Tonight, it reminded me of mine. The fourth night on the Solstice farm began with a kind of hush I hadn't yet heard during my stay. An unnatural stillness that felt less like silence and more like a held breath. And the air itself seemed suspended, thick and unmoving. So quiet that every sound I made, even the faint rustle of my coat as I hung it on the wall hook, seemed to echo inward rather than outward, as if the house were swallowing noise instead of producing it. Dusk was settling in, slow and deliberate, a muted gradient pulling the fields into shadow. The horizon faded into a dull violet bruise, and the edges of the farmhouse softened until the world outside the windows looked like a painting with its details smudged away. The temperature had dropped again, sharper now, the kind that makes even indoor air feel brittle and thin. I lit a few oil lamps, their soft amber glow pushing back the dark but never quite reaching the corners of the room. The hum returned, the moment full night fell, not the tentative, wavering pulse I'd felt before. Tonight it came with structure, rhythm, almost like breath drawn in long, synchronized cycles, each inhale stretching longer than the last. The vibration settled behind my sternum with such precision that for a moment I wondered if my own heartbeat had fallen out of sync and something else had stepped in to keep the rhythm alive. I stood in the center of the living room, listening with every part of my body. Something out in the field was breathing, not loudly, not forcefully, just endlessly. A slow rise, a slow fall, a long, patient exhale that seemed to tug at the air inside the house. Then the lights flickered. Not sputtering, not failing, no. They dimmed the way someone might dim their eyes while focusing on something very closely, as if the house itself were narrowing its gaze. The shadows on the walls stretched upward in languid, uncertain shapes. I reached toward the lamps, half expecting the glass to be warm from the proximity of a hand, not mine, but there was nothing, only the faint tremor of the flame reacting to the pressure in the room. Outside, the wind had died completely. The fields lay in total stillness. That was when the snow began to move. At first it was subtle, barely perceptible currents swirling low across the ground, but then, as if responding to some unseen cue, the motion grew deliberate. The surface pulsed outward in soft, concentric waves, rippling from the direction of the stone circle like rings spreading across a frozen lake. Each ripple expanded, slow and impossibly smooth, passing beneath the moonlight without disturbing it. I backed away from the window instinctively, though nothing had yet crossed the yard. My breath turned shallow, fogging the glass with each exhale. Another ripple, then another, each one larger than the last. The hum deepened. The fields shifted subtly in color, the snow darkening as if something beneath it cast a shadow upward rather than downward. A faint distortion pressed upward from the land, a bulge in the fabric of the night, then relaxed again, like a sleeping giant adjusting beneath a blanket of ice and powder. My throat tightened. The solstice wasn't until tomorrow night. Whatever lay beneath that field wasn't supposed to be stirring yet, unless the turning of the season wasn't determined by the calendar, but by the presence of someone who could hear it. I stepped back, heart hammering against the humming pressure. I tried to steady my voice, even though I wasn't speaking aloud. It's just winter. Settling. But even as the words formed, I knew they weren't true. Winter didn't breathe. Not like this. I didn't want to go outside. Every instinct in me recoiled at the thought. But something, the pulsing silence, the movement of the snow, the strange, magnetic draw of the stone circle kept pulling at me. I grabbed my coat, boots, and the heavy flashlight from the shelf near the door. My fingers trembled as I zipped my coat up to my chin. I told myself I only needed to check the generator, to make sure nothing crucial was failing, to prove I still had control over something. The moment I opened the door, the cold hit like a wall, dense, unmoving, too complete. Not even the faint whistle of wind accompanied it. The night felt heavy, as if the air had thickened into something with weight and form, something capable of leaning in around me. The snow crunched under my boots with unnatural clarity, each step a sharp, crisp sound that echoed far too loudly against the silence. My breath emerged in long, slow plumes, hanging in the air longer than it should have. As I made my way toward the generator shed, I noticed the surface of the snow shifting in that same rippling pattern I'd seen moments earlier, small waves expanding from the stone circle, passing beneath the earth, rising toward me like some kind of subterranean heartbeat. I flicked on the flashlight. The beam stretched across the field, illuminating nothing but the unbroken expanse of white. But something in the snow responded to the light. The nearest ripple paused, held itself perfectly still like a creature startled by a sudden glare. I shut the flashlight off immediately, heart stuttering with fear. I shouldn't have brought light out here. I remembered Clifford's warning. Don't turn on the outdoor floodlights on the night of the winter solstice. But was this why? Because light disrupted whatever lived beneath that circle? Or because light drew its attention? I kept walking, slower now. When I reached the shed, I hesitated before opening the door. The metal latch was so cold it burned through the glove. The hum in my chest grew taut, like a string pulled to its limit. I lifted the latch anyway, and the shed door groaned open. The generator was silent, completely silent, but it was still running. The gauges lit, the fuel line vibrating faintly under pressure, the motor spinning in perfect rhythm, yet there was no sound. Not muted, not low, just absent. Something had swallowed the generator's noise as cleanly as it swallowed the wind. I stepped back, pulse hammering against my ribs. A deep, low vibration rolled through the field, strong enough to rattle snow from the roof of the shed. The ground shifted under my boots in a single, slow swell. Not enough to knock me off balance, but enough to let me know. It felt me. It knew where I was. I turned toward the house. That was when I saw them. Across the field, ringed around the stone circle, stood a series of tall, dark silhouettes, featureless, motionless, perfectly still despite the shifting snow around their bases. They weren't shaped like people. They weren't shaped like anything I had a name for. They were long, narrow, black as absence, rising out of the earth with impossible symmetry. 12 of them, one for each stone, and for a moment so brief I might have misremembered it. One of them tilted its head toward me. The hum surged. My teeth vibrated. The ground trembled. I ran. Not a graceful run, not planned, not orderly. I sprinted blindly across the yard, boots slipping against the snow, breath tearing out of my chest in ragged bursts. Behind me, the field pulsed with movement, snow rising and falling as something enormous shifted beneath it. When I reached the porch, I yanked the door open with shaking hands and slammed it shut behind me, the echo ringing through the house with unnatural clarity. The hum didn't fade when I crossed the threshold. It followed me inside. It was everywhere now, deep, resonant, filling the structure of the house, the walls, the pipes, the very air. My vision blurred briefly, the lamps flickering again, shadows stretching like long fingers toward the floor. And then, a knock, soft, slow, methodical. 3 taps. On the back door, the one facing the circle. My breath caught. I turned my head slowly. Another knock, louder this time. A pause. And then, as the last lamp dimmed, a 3rd knock, but this one from the window beside me. Not with knuckles, not with fingertips, but with something harder, something like bone, something that had learned the outline of the house in the dark. The knocking did not continue. That was somehow worse than if it had. Silence rushed in, heavy and absolute, the kind that makes you acutely aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, your own presence in a place that no longer feels like it has room for you. I stood frozen in the dim glow of the oil lamps, feeling the cold radiate through the window glass. I couldn't bring myself to look directly at it, not yet. Every instinct told me that looking would be a kind of invitation, and I could not afford to offer that now. Instead, I backed away with slow, deliberate steps until I reached the staircase. Then I turned and climbed, the wood groaning under my weight, each step sounding like a warning from something old beneath the floorboards. The hum was stronger now, so strong that for a moment I thought the house itself might collapse inward, as if it were only a thin shell stretched over the vibrating air. Upstairs, the hallway was bathed in faint bluish moonlight leaking through the frost-glazed windows. I moved into the bedroom facing the fields and shut the door behind me. It made no difference. The hum passed through wood and plaster like air through a sieve. From this vantage point, the stone circle was visible, if visible was still the right word for the diffused darkness that lay over it. It no longer looked like shadow. The dark wasn't on the field. It was in the field, rising from beneath the snow like ink seeping through paper. The 12 standing silhouettes I'd seen earlier were still there, perfectly still, perfectly black, perfectly wrong. Only now, they were closer, half the distance they'd been before. No footsteps in the snow, no disturbance of the surface, just nearer. And in the center of the circle, something shifted under the snow, a slow swelling like a breath drawn from deep underground. The solstice was still hours away, but the longest night had already begun. I wanted to run. Every part of me screamed to grab my coat, throw open the front door, and sprint until the farmhouse was nothing but a dot swallowed by the horizon. But the snow was deep. The night was colder than anything I'd ever felt, and the field was awake. It would not let me leave. I paced the room, palms sweating, breath coming shallow and quick. My thoughts scattered, trying to piece together logic where none existed. I reached for my phone, no signal. I turned on the radio, only that soft, layered static again, the sound of 100 breaths drawn through a narrow space. I felt the house shift around me, the boards trembling in rhythm with the hum. This place is not empty, I thought. It never was. Then, below me, footsteps, inside the house, slow, measured, not heavy, yet not light. Something knowing exactly where the weight-bearing beams were, stepping only on the quiet spots, making only enough noise for me to know that it, if it was even the right word, was there. I pressed my hand to my mouth. The footsteps moved through the living room, across the hall, then stopped directly beneath the bedroom. The hum deepened, vibrating the bed frame, the window, my ribs. Then, a second set of footsteps, outside the house, walking in perfect counterpoint, one inside, one outside, both moving with the same slow, patient rhythm. A long pause, then a third set, coming from the field. The silhouettes were gone from the circle, all 12. I backed into the farthest corner of the room, heart hammering, eyes fixed on the window. The moonlight trembled as if the air itself were rippling. And then, impossibly, soundlessly, the snow outside compressed in a long, straight line leading from the field to the house, as if something massive but invisible had glided beneath it. The footsteps on the stairs began, not hurried, not searching, ascending, one slow tread at a time. I gripped the edge of the dresser, my knuckles pale. The hum filled the room, thick and resonant, pressing against my ears until it felt like my skull might crack. I whispered to myself nonsense words, half-formed prayers, anything to keep my mind anchored. When the doorknob turned, I nearly screamed. It didn't rattle, it didn't jerk, it simply rotated, slowly and smoothly, as though guided by a hand that had done this many times before. I held my breath, but the door didn't open. Instead, something slid across the floor just outside, something soft sweeping over wood, like fabric dragged along the surface. Then the knob turned back to its original position, and the footsteps retreated down the stairs, each step matching the rhythm of the hum. When they reached the bottom, the house fell silent again. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe the worst had passed. I was wrong. A bright flash spilled across the walls of the room, pale, white-blue, sharp as a blade. I rushed to the window just in time to see the source. The outdoor floodlights had come on. I hadn't touched them. I hadn't gone near the switch. Yet every flood lamp on the property blazed to life, illuminating the farmhouse, the yard, the barn, and the fields in harsh, unyielding brilliance. The snow around the stone circle erupted into motion, not upward, outward. A ring of displaced snow shot across the field like a shockwave, erasing the ripples and flattening everything in its path. The silhouettes, those tall, narrow forms, writhed violently in the sudden glare, their edges warping like smoke trapped in glass. Then they turned, all of them, at once, facing the house, facing me. The hum became a roar inside my bones. Not sound, not vibration, but something fundamental, something old enough that my body recognized it, even as my mind did not. The floodlights flickered, then dimmed, then flared again. Whatever lived beneath the field did not want them on. A deep bulge rose beneath the snow at the center of the circle, taller, larger than before, something pushing upward, something vast. The ground cracked faintly under the strain, thin lines of black opening across the white surface, and with each flicker of the lights, the silhouettes stepped closer, not walking, not gliding, simply appearing nearer, as though distance were something they had grown tired of obeying. The floodlights sputtered, dimmed, brightened, dimmed again. On the final dim, the silhouettes vanished. The hum stopped. The field went still. And then, from the back door of the house, a single, soft exhale, right on the other side of the wood, as if something enormous had pressed its face against it. The floodlights died completely. Darkness rushed in, and something began to whisper through the snow. Not a voice, not words, just a texture like breath drawn through layered cloth, 1,000 strands vibrating in unison. It moved around the house once, twice, a slow, deliberate circle, as if memorizing the shape of me inside. Then, quiet, stillness, a silence so complete it felt sculpted. I waited for dawn with my back against the far wall, knees pulled to my chest, flashlight clenched between frozen fingers, though I never dared turn it on. The hum never returned. No footsteps, no silhouettes, no sounds from the field. When the first hint of sunrise touched the windows at last, the world outside lay untouched except for one thing, a piece of fabric, charred at the edges, resting on the doorstep, hand-woven, ancient, not mine, not from this place, not from this time. I left the farm before noon, without packing properly, without looking back, but even now, months later, I still feel it sometimes, the faint tighten behind the eardrums, the small internal tremor, the subtle pull in the bones, a reminder the solstice comes every year, and whatever woke beneath that field has all the time in the world to wait for me again. Story 2. The Maintenance Log of Cabin 404. By the time I reached the old Cascade campground, the forest had a way of making me feel like I'd arrived somewhere I wasn't entirely meant to be. Somewhere that had closed itself off long before the National Park Service put up the official signs and declared the place dormant for seasonal restoration. That was a polite way of saying it had been abandoned for nearly a decade, left to the snow and the moss and the slow green creep of the forest, reclaiming what once belonged to it. The gravel road leading in was a zigzag of ruts half swallowed by wet leaves, so soft beneath the tires that I wasn't sure my truck would make it back out if the weather turned even a little worse. The air was heavy with the smell of cedar and damp earth, and the forest canopy pressed low overhead, filtering the late afternoon light into a kind of perpetual dusk. Even with the heater on, a chill kept threading its way into the cabin of the truck, the kind of cold that didn't come from temperature alone, but from atmosphere thick, old, expectant. Cabin 404 came into view around a bend, perched at the edge of a clearing that had once been a picnic area. It stood on short stilts, dark wood siding mottled with patches of lichen. The roof bowed slightly under years of neglect. Every other structure here, cabins 401 through 403, plus the ranger station, sat in various stages of collapse deeper in the trees, their windows boarded, their foundations tilting like they were slowly sinking back into the soil. But this cabin, for whatever reason, had been maintained, repaired, kept alive. The only one awarded electricity, water, a working stovetop. The only place suitable for a ranger to spend the winter maintenance rotation. My rotation. I parked beside the small supply shed and stepped out into the cold. The air smelled sharper here, tinged with pine sap and that faint metallic scent that comes after rain. My boots made soft indentations in the mossy ground as I walked toward the cabin door. The forest around me creaked in slow, elongated breaths, the sound of tall trees shifting against each other in the wind. Except there was no wind, not even the smallest stir of air. The door stuck slightly when I pushed it open, the wood swollen from moisture. Inside, the cabin looked much as the maintenance manual described. A narrow cot, a small desk, a propane heater, a wood stove, a kitchenette barely wide enough for a grown man to turn around in. But everything was neat, clean, recently wiped down. Someone had been here not too long ago. I set my bags down and walked through the rooms, letting the quiet settle around me. Sometimes an empty place hums with the memory of the last person who stayed in it, their routines, their footsteps, their warmth, still clinging faintly to the corners of the room. But cabin 404 felt scrubbed of all that, too clean, too empty, almost unnervingly still, as if whoever stayed here before me had taken great care to erase themselves. I spent the next hour unloading my gear, setting up my work logs, and double-checking the heating lines. When evening fell, the sky turned the color of wet slate and a thin fog drifted from the forest floor, curling around the cabin's stilts like pale fingers. I made myself a bowl of instant soup and ate it on the front steps, watching the silhouettes of the trees sway as if something deep within the forest exhaled and inhaled with long, slow patience. That was when I noticed the first notebook. It lay just beneath the step, half tucked into the wet soil, its dark green cover swollen slightly with moisture. I picked it up, brushing off leaves. The cover was blank, no name, no label. Inside, the writing was cramped and meticulous, the kind of handwriting someone might use if they feared running out of space before they finished what needed to be said. The first page read, Cabin 404, observation log. Distances approximate. Nights 1-3. Not a maintenance log. Not notes about faulty pipes or wildlife sightings or trail conditions. An observation log. I flipped through, scanning the entries. The first page described movement near cabin 401, though that cabin had been shuttered for 7 years. The writer described watching someone standing at the tree line around dusk, too distant to identify, but tall, narrow, unmoving, angled slightly toward this cabin. The next entry recorded the figure at 70 meters, then 55 meters, then 50. No signs of tracks in the soil, no footprints, no broken branches, just distance, and the figure always moving closer. I felt the forest shift around me, though I was sitting perfectly still. I kept reading. Night 2. The watcher returned. Stayed for 3 hours. Observed cabin 404 windows. Door remained locked. Distance 40 meters. A line had been crossed out so violently the paper had torn. I think he's closer tonight. I swallowed hard. flipping to the last entry written in that same cramped hand. Night 3. Distance 30 meters. Cabin windows locked at 1,900 hours. I don't know how he got to the porch without footsteps. He stood at the door for a long time. I heard breathing on the other side. I'm beginning to think. The writing ended mid-sentence. No signature. No date. A gust of cold swept across the step, though the air had been still moments before. I closed the notebook slowly, scanning the trees. The forest loomed dark and still, but the shadows between the trunks felt too deep, too tight, too watchful. I took the notebook inside and set it on the desk. The moment I closed the door behind me, the cabin's silence pressed in thickly, as though the logs had been waiting for me to return. Night settled fully. I made tea, sat on the cot, listened to the stove crackle, and then a soft tap on the glass. Just once, a single, gentle sound from the window near the desk. Too light to be an animal, too intentional to be the wind. I froze. Breath caught in my chest. The tap didn't repeat, but something in the cabin changed. A slight shift in pressure, a soft tightening of the air, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper of movement against the wooden planks beneath the floor. I turned to the window at last. Nothing. No shape. No face. Just trees, black and silent, crowding closer in the fog. I exhaled slowly, telling myself that isolation breeds imagination, that my mind was searching for patterns, that the notebook was just the ramblings of a previous ranger who'd spent too many nights alone. But then I opened the notebook again just to be sure I hadn't misread something and saw, near the back, the corner of another page tucked inward. When I pulled it open, 6 words waited for me in a different handwriting, sharper, more frantic. He's watching you from 20 meters. Named her, and beneath that, faint, smeared, maybe written by the same hand or maybe by someone else entirely, barely legible at the page's edge, do not turn off the lights. The cabin creaked, a long, low sound from beneath the floorboards, as if something had just shifted its weight. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, though fear certainly circled me like a persistent draft, but because the cabin itself would not let me fall fully into rest. No matter how tightly I wrapped the blankets around me, no matter how slow and steady my breathing became, something in the air kept a constant, delicate tension. It pulled at the edges of consciousness the way a distant dripping faucet keeps the brain half awake, half alert, waiting for the next sound. Every creak of the floorboards, every miniature settling of wood, every soft shift of temperature felt exaggerated, amplified by the silence pressing against the windows. The darkness outside the cabin had weight to it, not just the absence of light, but a presence, a thickness, as if the forest had expanded during the night and was now leaning its full body against the walls. Around 3:17 a.m. I remember the exact time because I had stared at the small analog clock on the desk for nearly an hour. The humming of the propane heater faltered, not stopped, not failed, just hitched, briefly, the way someone catches their breath when listening to a distant sound. I sat up, holding my breath without meaning to, waiting for the heater to exhale again. It did, but the second exhale sounded different, not mechanical, not normal, more like the faintest imitation of breath. I swung my legs off the cot, the cold wooden floor biting through the wool socks. The cabin smelled faintly of pine resin, damp wool, and the metallic tang of the heater coils. I walked toward the small window facing cabin 403, the closest of the abandoned structures, where a strip of moonlight cut through the fog. The forest beyond was motionless, absolutely motionless. Not a sway of branches, not a rustle of underbrush, not even the usual nocturnal drone of insects that tended to fill these mountains, even in winter. Just a silence so complete it felt curated, as if something had asked the forest to be still. I turned back toward the desk, toward the notebook I'd found. It lay closed now, but new unease blossomed in my stomach as I noticed the corner of the back cover curling up, as if moisture or heat had warped it, except the cabin was cold. Too cold for that. I reached for it, hesitated, then opened it again. The last page I'd read, the one that had warned, "He's watching you from 20 meters," was unchanged. But below that eerie line, something new had been written. Same sharp handwriting. Same frantic slant. 19 meters. I felt the blood drain from my face. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even blink. The room seemed to narrow, the air thickening like the cabin was shrinking inward around me. I closed the notebook with a trembling hand. Enough reading for one night, enough imagination. But imagination wasn't the thing creeping beneath the cabin, because that was when I heard it again, a soft, steady shift of weight beneath the floorboards. Not scurrying, not the scamper of wildlife, but something deliberate, something measured, like a person adjusting their stance carefully on old wooden planks. The cabin floor remained perfectly still, but the air swelled, pressing lightly against my skin in a way no normal draft ever could. I backed away slowly, my eyes drifting toward the heater, where the metal grate still pulsed faintly with its unnatural exhale. My heartbeat thundered through my ribs, quick and uneven, the sound almost loud enough to drown out the second shift beneath the floor. Almost. By morning, what little sleep I got had been shallow and feverish, full of half-formed images, trees leaning inward, a narrow shadow moving between trunks, pages turning without hands. When sunlight filtered through the window, weak and silver, it felt like the first real breath the cabin had taken in hours. I stepped outside, desperate for fresh air, and the cold hit me like a cleansing shock. The forest was damp, steam rising from the undergrowth like the remnants of a dream burning away at dawn. Birds had returned to the canopy, just a few, scattered and tentative, but their presence brought with it a thin layer of normalcy. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe the night had been a product of fatigue, snowlight, the claustrophobic architecture of an isolated cabin. Then I saw the tracks, not footprints, not paw prints, just disturbances of old depressions in the dead leaves and soft moss around. Cabin 404, exactly 20 of them, each spaced evenly apart, forming a ring around the structure, not deep enough for a human's weight, not shaped like any animal I knew, each depression identical, shallow, clean-edged, as if something had pressed the ground in perfect intervals. My breath fogged the air. I crouched to examine one. The moss hadn't been crushed. It had been flattened evenly, as if pressed with a smooth block or palm, but the diameter was too large for a hand, too imperfect for a tool, almost like the imprint of a shoulder, a knee, something jointed at the wrong angle. A whisper of movement caught the corner of my eye. I jerked my head up. Nothing, only trees, tall, unmoving, skeletal in the pale light, but the sensation of being watched crept up my spine like a cold finger. I spent the early afternoon completing the maintenance tasks I was assigned, checking trail markers along the east ridge, logging freeze damage along the creek, clearing debris from the base of the old fire tower. The work grounded me, kept my mind from circling the events of the night. The forest, in daylight, felt harmless, quiet, yes, but in the natural way the Cascades often were during winter. But each time I returned to cabin 404, the feeling returned, a soft pressure behind the ears, a slow tug at the base of the skull, the unmistakable sense of being studied. Around sunset, a ranger radio transmission crackled through, not unusual, since the district office checked in periodically. I answered, voice steady, trying not to reveal the things that lingered in the corners of my thoughts. "Everything's fine," I told them. "Quiet as expected. Cabin secure. They told me they'd check in again tomorrow. I wish they would stay on the line a few seconds longer." When the radio clicked off, the cabin's silence rushed back in. By nightfall, fog thickened in the clearing, rising in slow spirals that wound around the trees like drifting smoke. I locked every door, every window, every latch. The heater hummed again, normal this time. The air warmed, the cabin breathed, and for a moment I felt safe, until I noticed the second notebook. This one sat beside the wood stove, as if someone had placed it there gently while I had been outside. The cover was darker, almost black, the edges frayed, and the pages swollen from moisture. My hands went cold before I even touched it. Inside, the handwriting wasn't cramped and careful like the first notebook. This one was jagged, uneven, letters jutting into each other as if the writer's hand had shaken violently. I flipped to the first legible page. Night 4. Distance 15 meters. I swallowed hard. The next entry came fast. Night 5. Distance 10 meters. He moves when I blink. Then, night 6. Distance 6 meters. Window latch bent from the outside. He knows I'm awake. Then a line written in a frantic scrawl that nearly tore the paper. Stop looking for footprints. He doesn't use feet. The heater clicked sharply behind me and I nearly dropped the notebook. I turned to the very last page. Someone had written only 2 words. Tonight. 2 meters. 2 meters. Directly outside the wall. I looked up from the page, heart pounding so hard I felt it in my teeth. The cabin creaked. Something shifted weight beneath the floorboards. Not softly this time. Heavier. Closer. Then, a gentle, deliberate tap on the window. Right behind me. The tap on the window was so soft, so impossibly gentle, that for a moment I convinced myself it wasn't real. Just the cabin adjusting to the cold, I thought. Wood contracts, glass shivers, the forest breeze. All easily explained. All perfectly mundane. But when the second tap came slower, more deliberate, I felt something shift inside me. A sensation like a thread being pulled taut behind my sternum. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forceful. It was simply intentional. A quiet request for attention. I turned my head toward the sound. The window pane, still fogged from the cabin's heat, reflected faint glimmers of the dim oil lamp behind me. Beyond the glass, the forest pressed in closely. Its silhouettes fused together into a singular wall of darkness. The fog outside had thickened so much that even the outlines of the nearest trees were muted to pale, ghostly shapes. I stepped closer to the window not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't help it. Something in that tap had felt like my name being spoken in a language older than the forest itself. I wiped away a small circle of condensation with my sleeve and leaned toward the glass. At first I saw nothing but fog. Then deep within it I saw the faintest suggestion of a figure. Not a body, not a face, just a vertical disturbance, like a tall shadow whose edges were too straight to belong to any tree. It didn't move. It didn't sway. It simply existed in the exact place the notebook claimed it would be. 2 meters. I stepped back, my breath hitching, and nearly knocked over the lamp. It flickered, casting long, warped shadows across the cabin walls. A cold draft crept under the door, brushing against my ankles like a passing hand. I dropped into the chair by the desk, gripping its armrests, the ancient wood groaning beneath my weight as if sharing my unease. The second notebook lay open beside me. The final line stared back at me like a diagnosis. Tonight, 2 meters. My fingers twitched over the paper. The ink looked newer than the other entries, less faded, less smudged. The thought slithered into my mind. Before I could stop it, how recent was this written? The cabin creaked again. Not above, not below. Beside, near the wall closest to the window, a slow, dragging pressure passed along the exterior siding, like something brushing its palm or its jointed limb down the wooden boards. The sound wasn't abrasive. It was soft, almost affectionate. The air grew tighter and became harder to swallow. I closed both notebooks and placed them face down on the desk. For reasons I couldn't explain, I didn't like the idea of leaving them open, as if the pages might continue writing themselves in my absence. I locked the door latch again, even though it was already locked then, walked to the heater and raised the output. The flame inside flickered with a small, startled gasp. Heat flowed into the cabin, warm against my skin but doing nothing to ease the pressure crawling up the back of my neck. Night deepened. The fog outside thickened further, swirling against the windows in muted currents. The forest had gone silent again, completely silent, as if all the creatures within it were holding their breath. I kept the lights on, every one of them, the notebook's warning repeated in my head. Do not turn off the lights. Around midnight, the tap returned, not at the window this time, at the door. One gentle press of knuckles or bone against the wood, followed by another. Then a long, slow, dragging sound downward. I stood perfectly still. My lungs refused to inflate for several seconds. The cabin felt suddenly much smaller than it had earlier that day. The walls closing around me like the tightening of a fist. The oil lamp's flame trembled visibly, its light stretching into thin, trembling lines across the floor. Then, the breathing began. Not mine, not from the heater, not from any living thing I'd ever heard. It came from the thin seam beneath the door, the one place light escaped onto the fog-slicked ground outside. The breathing started slowly, in long pulls of air, the kind of deep inhalation someone uses to memorize the scent of a room. The sound was faint, almost tender, but beneath that softness, there was a layered quality, multiple strands woven together into a single breath, like someone breathing with two lungs that weren't shaped like lungs. I pressed a hand over my mouth, terrified that even the sound of my own breathing might invite a response. The breathing stopped. A hush filled the cabin. Then, a whisper of movement at the window. Not a tap this time. Not pressure. A slow shift, like someone repositioning themselves for a better view. I turned slowly toward the glass. The fog parted for just a moment, and I saw it. A silhouette, tall, too tall, standing no more than a few feet from the window. Its outline was wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Too long at the top, too narrow at the base. Its proportions stretched as though it had been pulled upward by invisible hands. The fog clung around it but did not obscure it, as if the figure repelled the mist, creating a hollow pocket of clarity. Then, it had bent, not at the waist, but from somewhere much higher up, a slow, elegant hinge downward, as if lowering its head to regard me. I stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the rug and catching myself on the chair. The window panes vibrated just slightly, as if the figure outside was pressing its weight against the very air. I kept my eyes open wide, unblinking, because the notebook had said something that now echoed violently in my mind. He moves when I blink. My eyes burned, the room blurred. My breath came shallow and rapid when the figure finally faded back into the fog, dissolving into the forest like smoke curling through branches. I didn't feel relief. I felt dread, because its departure was intentional, measured, not a retreat, but a step back, a repositioning. A moment later, a soft, hollow thump echoed from the wall behind me, as though something had just leapt from the porch roof onto the cabin roof. Not heavy, not hurried, just present. A slow walk followed footsteps too spaced to be human, landing only on the beams strong enough to hold weight. The sound traveled across the ceiling, circling above me, each step separated by a stretch of silence so exact it felt calculated. I backed into the center of the room, hands trembling. The cabin felt like a trap, not because I was stuck inside it, but because something outside was mapping every inch of it, learning its edges, learning mine. When the footsteps stopped directly above the bed, the air tightened again. A soft exhale drifted through the ceiling boards, and then, slowly, something pressed downward, bowing the wooden planks by a fraction of an inch. Not enough to break them, just enough to let me know it could. I stood there for what felt like hours, afraid to sit, afraid to lie down, afraid to blink, afraid to darken the room by even a fraction of a second. The rooftop footsteps eventually retreated, shifting carefully back toward the far side of the cabin. Then they stopped altogether, but I didn't feel alone, not even for a moment. Near dawn, with the first gray hints of light seeping into the clearing, I dared to look out the window again. The fog had thinned, revealing the forest in muted silhouettes. Snow had begun to gather on the cabin roof, softening the edges. And directly at the tree line, where the fog was thickest, a tall shape stood waiting, not moving, not approaching, just there, exactly 2 meters beyond the reach of the porch, exactly where the notebook had said, as if distance was not a measurement at all, but a decision. I stayed standing long after the sky began to pale, long after the heater cycled through its slow mechanical breaths, long after the silhouette at the tree line dissolved into the thinning fog. Dawn should have absolved some of the tension, should have broken the spell that the dark had cast over the clearing, but in this place, daylight felt more like an intermission than a reprieve. The forest looked less hostile now, but not less watchful. Sunlight filtered weakly through the cedar branches, falling in faded gold ribbons across the mossy earth. Only then did my legs begin to tremble from the exhaustion of staying alert for so many hours. I sank onto the chair by the desk, the wood groaning softly beneath me. My hand shook as I lifted the mug of cold tea, its surface filmed with a thin layer of oil from the stale leaves. As I drank, the bitterness seemed to scrape the back of my throat. I forced myself to open the door and breathe the outside air, hoping its freshness would reset my nerves. The clearing was quiet, but not in an ordinary way. It was quiet the way a held breath is quiet, the way the seconds before an earthquake are quiet. The trees were coated with beads of mist that clung to their needles like tiny eyes. The ground around the cabin still bore the strange oval depressions I had seen the day before, but now a new set joined them, fainter, less symmetrical, as though something had crouched low, pressing not feet, but its weight against the moss. I checked the perimeter of the cabin, pretending to focus on maintenance tasks, but really marking distances in my head: each tree, each beam of the porch, the angles at which a person or creature might stand unseen. The forest felt thicker today, the trunks more numerous, the underbrush darker. I felt, with a certainty I could not explain, that there were more places to hide now than yesterday, as if the forest had quietly grown new pockets of shadow during the night. Back inside, the heater's warmth enveloped me, yet I still couldn't shake the cold that had settled beneath my skin. The scent of wet wood, old wool, and the faint metallic tang of last night's fear clung to the cabin's interior. I unlatched a window to let in fresh air, but the moment the glass cracked open, I heard it. A shuffle, a soft, quick shift of weight, at the exact spot where the silhouette had stood hours earlier. I closed the window immediately. I avoided the notebooks for as long as I could that morning. They sat on the desk like two sleeping animals, one stiff-backed and swollen with moisture, the other warped and soft at the corners, both carrying an intent I couldn't name. Eventually I forced myself to approach them, as if confronting them might reclaim some sense of control. I opened the first notebook, the green one. The pages were unchanged, still bearing the same cramped handwriting, still ending mid-sentence. But when I flipped to the next page, the blank page I remembered was no longer blank. Someone had written in the margins, not in pen, not in pencil, but in pressure. The indentations were faint, as though someone had written with a blunt object, or perhaps with a fingernail, pressing just hard enough to leave a ghost of letters behind. I angled the page toward the lamp. The words revealed themselves slowly. Stop checking the windows. My chest tightened. The skin along my arms prickled. I traced the indent with my finger, but the pressure carvings were so shallow they might disappear with one wrong touch. Before I could process that message, a soft thud sounded outside, then another, then a slow drag, but no footsteps followed, no approach. Just those occasional, disquieting shifts, like something pacing, adjusting itself, waiting. I opened the second notebook, the black one. My heart sank. More writing. New writing. The ink was still wet. Night 7. Distance 2 meters. He waits for permission. He mimics your steps. Don't walk. Don't blink. Don't. The sentence ended suddenly, as if the writer had been pulled away mid-stroke. The ink smeared into a thin trail like the pen had been dragged sideways. My pulse hammered. The next page bore only a single line, centered neatly in the middle. He checks your distance, too. I snapped the notebook shut, panic flaring through me. For a moment, I paced the cabin in tight circles, unable to think clearly. The heater hummed evenly, too evenly, as if syncing itself with the rhythm of my breath. The walls felt close. The windows felt vulnerable. I had to get out. Not out of the clearing because something in me knew the forest was worse, but out of the cabin, away from the notebooks. Away from this growing sense that the inside of the cabin was being carefully studied and mapped. I grabbed my coat, stepped outside, and stopped instantly. The fog had returned. Not thin morning mist, not drifting air, but a dense column of white pressing between the trees like a curtain being drawn across a stage. And within that curtain stood a figure, tall, wrongly proportioned. Still, its edges seemed to bend the fog rather than disappear into it. It didn't seem bothered by the daylight, though the light seemed bothered by it. The fog brightened around its outline, making it stand out with alarming clarity. It did not move. It did not breathe. It simply watched. I stepped backward, slowly, my boots sinking into the moss with a soft squelch. The figure's shape shifted not toward me, not advancing, but tightening, becoming narrower, as though it were folding itself inward. The air between us thickened, and I felt a faint pressure in my ears, as if the forest was sinking in altitude. Then I heard it, a whisper. Not near me, inside the cabin. I turned slowly to look through the window. The notebooks had opened, pages turning one by one, not blown by wind, not nudged by vibration. Turned, slowly, deliberately. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut. The figure outside didn't react, as if the door had no significance to it. On the desk, one notebook lay open on a fresh page. A new line was written in the same shallow pressure. "You're not alone in here." My stomach dropped. I turned, scanning every corner of the room, the narrow cot, the cramped kitchenette, the darkened corners between the crates of supplies. Nothing moved. Nothing felt different, except the air. It felt occupied. Something shifted beneath the floorboards again. But this time, instead of a single weight, I heard two. One heavier, one lighter, moving in slow, mirrored steps before stopping directly beneath my feet. A soft creak passed through the floor. Then, tap from the far wall. A response tap from the opposite side, as if two entities had circled the cabin and now triangulated exactly where I stood. I backed away from the center of the room, clutching the edge of the desk. My breath fogged the cold air in uneven bursts. The notebooks turned another page. This time the ink was fresh, wet, the letters wobbling slightly as though written in haste. "Get ready," he writes when you don't. What was friend? A final shadow passed over the cabin roof, heavy, angled, wrong, and the ceiling boards bowed once again. Not near the window, not near the door, above the bed, exactly above the place where someone would lie down if they were too tired to remain awake, exactly above where the previous ranger might have slept, exactly where, right now, the notebooks wanted my attention to be. The cabin let out a low, aching creak, like a throat clearing itself. Then, something tapped from inside the wall beside me, not from outside, not under the floor, not on the roof, inside, as if someone or something was leaning its head against the wood, listening through it for a long moment. After that tap from inside the wall, I couldn't move, not because I was frozen in fear, though fear was certainly there, clinging to the inside of my throat, but because something about the sound felt deeply wrong in a way that bypassed thought altogether. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even aggressive. It was soft, curious, exploratory. The kind of tap a person might make when checking whether a friend is awake in the next room. I pressed my back against the desk, the wood hard against my shoulder blades. The air in the cabin tightened around me like a constricting cord. The heater exhaled its warm, steady breath. But even that felt like an intrusion, like a second pulse in a room too small for one pulse, let alone two. Then, slowly, a new sound emerged. The wall breathed, not creaked, not shifted, breathed. A slow expansion of wood fibers, a faint exhale into the insulation, a subtle intake of cold air along the seams where the planks didn't quite meet. If you've ever pressed your ear against someone's chest while they sleep, you know that careful, rhythmic cadence, something intimate, almost tender. That was the sound I heard now, except it came from the architecture itself, like the cabin had decided to mimic the living. A whispering vibration trembled against the paper on the desk. One of the notebooks slid an inch, not pushed, not blown, just guided. I stared at it, throat dry. It opened on its own, the pages riffling slowly at first, then more decisively, until it stopped near the back. A single sentence waited on a fresh page, written with an ink so new it gleamed. "He wrote last night." A chill spread down my spine. On the next page, another line appeared, written not all at once, but slowly, one stroke at a time, as if an invisible hand traced each letter in real time. "Did you?" I stumbled backward, knocking over the chair. The legs clattered on the wood floor with startling violence, shattering the tense quiet. The cabin reacted immediately. The breathing in the walls fell silent. The pressure in the air shifted. The weight above the ceiling stilled. And then, from outside, a voice. Not a human one. Not exactly. But it carried a tonal shape close enough to pass if you weren't listening carefully. A voice that pressed the words into the fog rather than projecting them. Cabin. 404. Slow. Measured. Like someone testing the shape of the numbers. Then, neighbor. The last word stretched too long. The final consonant dissolving into a low vibration that traveled through the floorboards and into my teeth. I staggered to the window. The fog had cleared just enough to reveal the clearing in muted gray. And there, at the tree line, stood the silhouette again, taller in daylight than it had any right to be. Narrow, upright, motionless. Its shape bent the light around it, distorting the branches behind it. But from the corner of my eye, I noticed something worse. A second silhouette, standing a few feet to its left, shorter, broader at the shoulders, identical posture. And another, a small line of them, 5, 6, perhaps more, gathered at the forest edge like a row of statues placed in perfect alignment. Their proportions were subtly different, some too tall, some slightly hunched, some with arms or limbs angled in ways that made my stomach knot. They watched the cabin with stillness so complete it felt like time around them had collapsed. The cabin exhaled again, a long, slow, shuddering breath. The heater flickered and went out, instantly, completely, as if plucked from existence. Cold rushed in, pressing down my spine. The silence deepened. The fog seemed to lean closer to the windows. Then, a soft thump on the roof. Then a second, 2 different weights, moving toward the center of the cabin. Another entry appeared in the notebook, written quickly, slanted, words crowding the page. You're writing too late. Another line beneath it. It takes the ones who don't record. Then one final line, hurried and crooked, the ink splattered from the pen shaking. Write, or be written. My knees weakened. I grabbed the edge of the desk to stay upright. My breath came in uneven gasps, fogging the glass of the window. The silhouettes at the tree line did not move. They stood, arranged in a semicircle now, as if waiting for something to be completed. Something above me shifted its weight again. Not a creature pacing, not a body crawling. Something adjusting its shape to match the beams. A whisper leaked through the ceiling. A breath, followed by a single word. Close. I snapped, whether from fear or instinct. I grabbed the nearest notebook and began writing. Writing anything. Words I didn't think through. Observations, descriptions, things I saw. Things I felt. The temperature of the room, the angle of the window, the position of the silhouettes, my own shaking breath, my own heartbeat, my own distance from the door. The moment my pen touched paper, the cabin shifted. The weight above me stopped moving. The walls tightened their hold around the air. The fog pulled back from the windows by a fraction of an inch. The notebook let me continue. It wanted me to continue. I wrote until my hand cramped, till sweat gathered at the base of my neck, until I felt something watching from only inches away, something patient, something waiting for the moment my pen stopped. But eventually, exhaustion won. My fingers loosened. The pen slipped. The instant it hit the floor, the cabin inhaled sharply. A scraping sound dragged across the roof. The window fogged in one instant, as if something huge leaned close to breathe against it. Inside the wall, the tapping resumed fast, eager, urgent. I scrambled for the notebook. Too late. The next message was already written for me. You stopped. My heart lurched painfully. The page turned without hands. A final message appeared. Slow and deliberate. Now you understand. And then, beneath it, a neighbor writes the neighbor. The cabin door locked from the inside clicked. Once, softly, not opening. Just acknowledging, a courtesy, a greeting, an invitation. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I didn't open the door. Instead, I did what every previous ranger must have eventually done. I sat down. I opened a fresh page, and I began to write. Not to report, not to record, but to survive. I've been home for months now. A new ranger was assigned to cabin 404 this winter. I check the district logs every week. No updates so far. No notes. No calls. But sometimes late at night, I find myself waking beside my nightstand, notebook open, pen in hand, halfway through a sentence I don't remember starting. Something about distance. Something about windows. Something about a figure near the trees. Sometimes the writing is mine. Sometimes it isn't. And sometimes, when I blink, I can almost swear I see someone at the foot of my bed. A tall, narrow shadow, angled slightly toward me, waiting for me to finish the sentence before it can write the next one. Story 3. When the boat finally cut its engine, the sudden quiet dropped over the water like a blanket. The waves lapped softly against the hull, gentle but insistent, carrying with them a deep, rhythmic undertow, almost like the subtle, distant pulse of something that had been breathing beneath the surface long before I ever stepped onto this island. I stepped off the boat onto the slick, barnacle-flecked pier and felt the wind slip around my ribs with a cold confidence that reminded me how far I was from the mainland. Lighthouse Rock wasn't a name on any modern map. On the nautical charts the Coast Guard emailed me, the island had no designation beyond a set of coordinates and a faint dotted outline. Most people simply called it the Rock, though that phrase didn't capture much. To me, in that gray afternoon light, it looked like the head of some ancient creature rising out of the Pacific, a steep eruption of black basalt, carved by centuries of wind and salt water into jagged ridges that resembled ribs, spines, vertebrae. The lighthouse itself rose from the highest point, cylindrical and bone-white against the dark stone, its glass crown catching the thin winter sunlight like an unblinking eye. I was here, officially, as a historian. Unofficially, I was here because I had spent 3 years researching a cluster of maritime disappearances along the Oregon coast, disappearances that all seemed to circle back not directly, but in sideways insinuations, in whispered mentions to this forgotten lighthouse and the man who once kept its light burning. His name was Rowan Hale, and 52 years ago, he vanished from this place without a single footprint left in the soft earth around the keeper's house. The boatman, a quiet man with weathered skin and a thin salt and pepper braid, didn't wait for conversation. He simply nodded once, muttered something that sounded like "before dusk," and pushed the boat back into the water, the engine sputtering reluctantly before catching. I watched him drift backward, the boat shrinking into the horizon until it was nothing but a smudge on the endless gray sheet of the ocean. When it was gone, a heavy silence settled over the island, a silence broken only by the soft whistle of wind slipping between rocks and the echoing caw of a solitary gull perched high on the lantern room railing. I hefted my bag and climbed the narrow path leading upward. The rocks beneath my boots were slick from years of sea spray, and each step carried a hint of vertigo, as though the island itself shifted ever so slightly beneath me. The smell of salt, rot, and wet stone filled my lungs with each breath. Somewhere below, the waves boomed in slow, powerful intervals against the cliff's deep, resonant thuds that felt like the heartbeat of something massive residing within the island. At the top of the path stood the lighthouse keeper's cottage, a wooden structure gone silver with age, its planks warped from decades of storms. The windows were clouded with mineral deposits, the door slightly ajar as if someone had stepped outside only minutes before. I paused on the threshold, listening. The wind played against the cottage walls with long, whistling sighs. Inside, everything smelled faintly of mildew and cold iron. The cottage wasn't large, just a narrow kitchen, a small sitting room, and a bedroom at the back. Furniture had been removed years ago, except for a wooden desk bolted to the floor, its drawers warped shut. On the wall opposite the desk hung a crooked frame containing a faded photograph of the lighthouse keeper Rowan Hale himself, standing near the cliff edge, his coat whipping around him, his face half turned away from the camera. Something about the image unsettled me, not because it looked sinister, but because Rowan appeared almost transparent at the edges, as if his body blurred into the sea spray. I approached the desk out of habit, running my fingers lightly along the grain of the wood. A thin layer of dust clung to my fingertips, but underneath it, beneath the stale surface, was a faint, lingering imprint of use. Someone had touched this desk recently. Not years ago, not decades. Recently, the wind shifted, pushing the door half shut with a dull thud. I startled, turning sharply toward the sound. The cottage felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls had drawn close around me. I inhaled slowly, letting the tension settle. It was then, as the wind quieted, that I heard it. A single, soft note, not a whistle, not a human call. Something lower, resonant, a vibration threading through the stones beneath my feet, rising into the wooden boards of the floor. A hum. I stepped outside onto the small porch, letting the cold air clear my head. The lighthouse, only 100 feet away, loomed tall and stoic against the dull horizon. Its metal catwalk circled the lantern room like a thin black crown, and then just as I stared, something glinted behind the glass. A flash, quick, precise, too deliberate to be the sun. The lighthouse was decommissioned. Every source I had consulted insisted the wiring had been stripped years ago. The generator removed, the lens left to gather dust and condensation. Yet, in that instant, I could have sworn the lantern flickered with a pale gleam, cold metallic, like moonlight caught on a knife. The hum came again, this time stronger, a thin tremor that moved through the air like a ripple in deep water. I descended the porch steps and crossed the narrow yard toward the tower. The closer I came, the colder the air felt, as though sunlight couldn't quite penetrate the lighthouse's shadow. The stones around the base were coated with slick algae and small, sharp shells that crunched under my boots with each step. When I reached the door to the lighthouse, I hesitated. The metal handle was pristine, not shining, but untouched by rust. My breath fogged the air in long, steady streams. The hum pulsed again, a slow, rhythmic vibration rising through the stones, as steady as the turning of a heavy wheel deep beneath the seabed. I touched the door handle. It was warm, not from sunlight, not from weather, warm like something breathing on the other side. I pulled the door open. The darkness inside seemed to inhale as I stepped in, swallowing the daylight behind me. The metal staircase spiraled upward in narrow circles, each step groaning under my weight. A faint odor of brine, rust, and something older, something faintly organic drifted down from above. Halfway up, I saw them, small scraps of paper scattered along the inner edge of the stairs. Water damaged, torn, edges curled. I bent down to pick one up. The ink had bled in places, but I could still make out a few shaky, handwritten words. Don't let them look. Another scrap lay 2 steps higher. The reflection is never. I climbed faster now, my hands slick on the cold railing. The hum grew stronger, vibrating faintly in the metal under my grip. At the top of the stairs, I pushed open the hatch to the lantern room. Cold air exploded around me. Every pane of glass was covered in condensation, the droplets running in thin, trembling rivulets. The great Fresnel lens towered at the center of the room like a giant, frozen eye, fractured, fogged, and faintly glimmering. And then my breath stopped, because pressed against the glass on the outside of the lantern room was a handprint, large, webbed, shaped like something meant to grasp both above and below the waterline. I stumbled back. The hum surged. The lighthouse vibrated around me. The lens flickered with a cold, impossible gleam. And then a face appeared in the reflection, not behind me, not in the glass itself, but in the reflection of the sea below. A pale, dripping face with dark, hollow eyes. My face staring back at me from the water 30 feet below. Except I was inside the lantern room, and I was not looking into the sea. For a long moment I couldn't move, not because I was frozen in fear, but because something in the reflection held me the way deep ocean currents hold drifting kelp. The face, staring back at me from the water below, was unmistakably mine, but distorted, blurred at the edges in a way no reflection should be. The mouth was set wrong, too tight at the corners. The eyes were darker, hollowed, as if someone had carved them out and filled them with the color of deep water. And yet, the reflection seemed to breathe, not in sync with me, not opposite me, but independently, its chest rising and falling in a slow, patient rhythm that did not match the frantic thrum beneath my ribs. I forced myself to blink, and the reflection responded by tilting its head, not mimicking my movement, no. Responding to it, acknowledging it, I stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the damp metal flooring. The cold air in the lantern room tightened around me like a fist. I told myself that the condensation on the glass, the refracting light, the impossible angles of the frontal lens might create illusions. I tried to rationalize, to ground myself in the known world, but nothing about the face I saw belonged to illusion. It belonged to presence, a presence that now knew I was here. I tore my gaze from the glass and forced myself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale the way one does when trying to keep the mind from fraying. My chest ached with a cold that wasn't from the air. The entire lighthouse seemed to pulse with that low hum I'd felt earlier, as though something deep beneath the island was waking, turning, adjusting itself in the dark. I descended the spiral stairs as quickly as the slippery metal allowed, each footstep echoing upward like a hollow drumbeat. The air thickened the farther down I went, the smell changing subtly from brine and rust to something faintly organic, salt-wet skin, algae, the sweet rot of kelp left too long on the tide line. When I stepped out of the lighthouse, the wind hit me with a force I hadn't felt earlier. It rushed around the tower in tight circles, pulling at my coat, tugging the hair at my temples. I looked around sharply. The sky had darkened while I was inside, shifting from washed-out gray to a low, bruised blue that pressed down on the island like the lid of a jar. The sea was louder now, its waves hammering the basalt cliffs with long, deep thuds that vibrated up through the ground. The calls of gulls had vanished entirely. Their absence left a yawning hole in the soundscape, making the island feel even more removed from the world than before. I stepped toward the cottage, desperate for its fragile warmth, when I noticed something new lying just outside the door. A piece of parchment, not paper parchment, water-warped, salt-stained, edges torn, creases running through it like the veins of a leaf. My stomach tightened. I bent to pick it up, but before my fingers touched it, I recognized the texture. Not by look, but by something deeper, something instinctual. It was the same material as the scraps inside the lighthouse. I lifted it carefully. The parchment was cold and slick, like it had been submerged for hours before drying in the sea wind. The ink had bled, but the words written in the same shaky hand I'd seen on the stairs were still legible. The sea takes what looks like it. Do not let it look at you too long. My breath caught. Beneath that line, pressed faintly into the water-warped surface, as if written with pressure instead of ink, was another message, harder to read, lighter, more frantic. They watch from below the lens. One of them already knows your face. I swallowed hard, feeling a cold surge of dread run through me. Then I noticed the bottom corner of the parchment, a date written in ink that hadn't bled, the 14th of June, 1971. Rowan Hale, the missing lighthouse keeper, the man whose disappearance I was researching. He disappeared on the 14th of June, 1971. This was his handwriting. My pulse hammered in my throat. I turned the parchment over. On the back, so lightly written I almost missed it was a third line. The letters crooked and tentative. I hear them climbing the glass. A gust of wind tore through the clearing at that exact moment, almost wrenching the parchment from my hands. I clutched it tightly, the words searing themselves into my thoughts. Then, without warning, the lighthouse light flickered. A pale, cold gleam darted across the fog-thickened sky. Not bright like a working beacon, but sharp, thin, surgical. It cut across the rocks, slicing through the air with unnatural precision before dimming again. The island fell into a tense, listening silence. I turned slowly toward the tower. Something moved behind the condensation-blurred glass of the lantern room. A silhouette, human-shaped, but too long in the shoulders, too narrow at the hips. Watching, still, silent. The breath whooshed out of my lungs. I stepped backward, my boots crunching against gravel. Then the light flickered again. Once, twice, as if responding to my movement. I bolted for the cottage. Inside, the stale air felt almost welcoming in comparison. I slammed the door shut and braced my hands against the rough wood paneling. For several seconds, I listened. The waves, the wind, my heartbeat. Then, another sound, a faint tapping, not from the door, not from the window, from beneath the floorboards. Slow, deliberate, measured taps, as if someone or something was learning the layout of the cottage by touch. I dropped to one knee and pressed my ear to the boards. A breath rose through them, long, wet, distorted by water. I jerked away, scrambling to my feet. My legs trembled so badly I had to steady myself against the wall. The cottage door rattled in the wind. The frame groaned. The air tasted faintly metallic, as if charged with salt-heavy electricity. I stepped backward toward the desk, toward the only piece of furniture that felt anchored in this place. And that was when I saw the notebook. Not Rowan's, not mine, the third one, lying on the desk, the cover swollen, the pages damp. I hadn't brought it in. I hadn't seen it before. With shaking fingers, I cracked it open. The first page bore a single sentence, written with an unsteady hand. Do not open the window. The next page, do not look at the reflection again. Now, the next, do not answer the knock. And the final page, the ink smeared, the letters jagged. You must not meet yourself. Something thudded gently against the cottage wall. Then a second time, then a third, a slow, rhythmic knock, but not at the door, not at the window, at the side of the cottage, near the exact height of my head. I pressed my back to the wall opposite it, the notebook trembling in my hands. Outside, moving in tandem with the knocks, came a new sound. A wet, dragging, deliberate shift, like something climbing the rocks in slow, confident increments. The wind died. The sea held its breath. The island listened, and somewhere above me, high in the lighthouse, the light flickered again. This time, it stayed lit, and in the reflection of the cottage window, not in the glass itself, but in the reflection of the lighthouse, visible through it, I saw a shape standing in the lantern room. It wasn't me. And yet, it turned its head, as if it recognized me. For several minutes after I saw the figure inside the lantern room, I couldn't make myself breathe in a steady rhythm. It wasn't shock, not entirely. It was something else. Something that threaded itself through the ribs and knotted behind the sternum. Recognition, perhaps, or the sickening hint of recognition without memory. The kind of feeling one gets when seeing a childhood photograph of themselves taken at an age they cannot possibly remember. Yet the image still carries a strange, intimate familiarity. The figure inside the lighthouse did not move again. It stood perfectly still, its body silhouetted against the pale, flickering glow of the lens. But the stillness felt intentional, waiting, listening for me. I backed away from the window, keeping my eyes on the lighthouse even as I fumbled for the oil lamp on the desk. The light sputtered alive with a soft cough of flame, pushing back the dim interior shadows by only a few feet. The cottage was small, barely 4 walls and a stove, and yet it felt cavernous in that moment, as though the air between each plank had expanded into hollow, breathing spaces. Then, faintly, the tapping resumed, but not from the same place as before. This time, it came from the roof, a soft, irregular tapping, like fingertips, or something shaped like fingertips testing the surface of the wooden shingles. The sound moved in slow arcs, circling the cottage, tracing the edges almost thoughtfully. Every few seconds, the tapping paused as though the thing above were tilting its head, listening for a response. I remained completely still. The notebook I'd opened earlier lay on the desk, pages curled, ink still drying. My eyes drifted toward it slowly. The last line I had read echoed in my mind. You must not meet yourself. A warning, a plea, a rule. But rules implied something had happened before. Something had been repeated. Something had consequences. The tapping shifted again, this time sliding from the roof down toward the northern wall. The sound was sticky, wet, almost adhesive, like seaweed dragged slowly across wet stone. My breath tightened. Slowly, deliberately, I stepped backward until my shoulders pressed against the far wall, the wood cold enough to seep through the fabric of my shirt. A faint scraping noise joined the tapping, long, thin, deliberate scratches, tracing patterns just beneath the surface of the planks. Not carving, not trying to enter, more like drawing or writing. The cottage walls responded with low groans, as if the structure itself was trying to expand away from the pressure. The oil lamp flickered once, twice, and then something shifted under the floorboards. A single, slow displacement of weight, as if someone inside the crawl space had adjusted their position. My breath caught in my throat. Something moved again. Just a slight change, a settling sound, like knees or elbows against packed earth. No animal in the Pacific Northwest moved like that. No raccoon, no opossum, no otter. This was methodical. Slow, checking where I was standing. I crouched down and pressed my ear to the floorboards, just long enough to hear it. Breathing, wet, rhythmic, the kind of breath pulled through gills before forced through lungs, layered, as though more than one set of lungs worked in half unison. I jerked back so fast I nearly toppled the lamp. Something under the cottage paused. Then came a sound I will never forget, a thin, patient scraping against the underside of the floor, the long stroke of something that wanted to understand the shape of my footsteps. The air thickened. The cottage felt too small, too finite, too fragile to protect me from the intelligence sampling it from all sides. Then, a knock, not on the roof, not under the cabin, not on the door, on the window, slow, soft, polite. My spine locked. For several seconds, I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't dare shift my weight on the wooden boards. The knock came again, gentle, almost apologetic. A request. My instinct screamed at me not to look, but curiosity, the same instinct that had brought me to this island, dragged my gaze upward. The window pane was clouded with fog from the lamp's heat. Behind it, the outside world was a blur of muted gray. And through that blur, something pressed lightly against the glass, a shape like a hand, but not a hand at all. The silhouette was webbed, elongated, its joints too fluid, its edges trembling with the movement of water still dripping from its surface. I choked back a gasp. The hand remained, patient. Then, the second hand, higher on the glass, both pressed inward softly. Testing. The lighthouse's hum deepened, vibrating through the ground in a slow pulse. The cottage vibrated in response. And the reflection in the window, not the hand, not the fog, but the faint mirrored image from outside, shifted. The face I had seen earlier in the lantern room was visible again, but closer, much closer. Not inside the lighthouse, standing right outside the cottage window. Only the fog distorted the features, blurring the hollows of the eyes, smearing the mouth into a cold, wet line. My mouth went dry. The figure outside tilted its head again, that same slow, too fluid motion, as if studying me. A louder scraping noise echoed under the cottage, a shift of weight directly below my knees. Something beneath me was crawling toward the center of the floor. Something above me was sliding along the roof. Something beside me was tracing the window with its fingertips. And something inside the lighthouse was watching all of it, coordinated, or connected, or simply the same thing in different shapes. My pulse raced. I backed away from the window, from the walls, from the floorboards until my calves hit the desk and I stumbled into the wooden chair. I clutched the edge of the desk like it was a lifeline. My vision swam. The notebook on the desk opened on its own. A single page turned. Then, slowly, as if an invisible hand dragged a wet fingertip across the surface, a new line formed in the watery ink. It's not looking at you. Now, Izzard. Another line appeared beneath it. It's looking for you. My chest tightened. The lamp flickered more violently. Then the final line bled into the page. Letters smudged, as if written by a trembling hand. One of them is you. My stomach dropped. A shadow swept past the window, moving toward the lighthouse. The light above flickered. The hum deepened. A long, wet drag sounded beneath the floor. And then, for the first time since I stepped onto Lighthouse Rock, I heard something unmistakably human. A voice, calling from the cliffs below. My name, spoken with my exact voice. When I first heard my name rising from the cliffs below, I didn't believe it. It floated upward on the wind in a strangely careful cadence, each syllable stretched thin, as though someone unfamiliar with language were testing the sound for weight and texture. My initial instinct was to tell myself it was the ocean, the wind, the distorted echo of waves striking rock. But even as I formed that excuse, I knew it wasn't true. The voice had shape, tone, intention, and worst of all, it matched my own voice exactly. Not similar, not reminiscent, exactly. A second call followed, this one quieter, as though whoever or whatever was mimicking me had just discovered how sound worked and was experimenting. The syllables were softer, rounder, but each one struck something deep in my chest with the precision of a memory emerging from a dream. I stumbled backward from the window, nearly overturning the chair as I did. The lamp flame bobbed violently, shadows jerking up the walls like long, thin fingers. Under the floor, the slow drag of movement paused. On the roof, the weight above me drew a long, deliberate breath. The voice called again. Same tone, same rhythm, same me, but wrong. Wrong in the way a reflection is wrong when the angle of the mirror distorts. Wrong the way a voice sounds when echoed in a cavern that isn't shaped for humans. Wrong the way an old reel-to-reel tape recording warps a person's words when left too long in damp air. I took a step toward the door, not because I wanted to, but because the instinctual part of me, the deepest, most primitive part, reacted to hearing someone who sounded like me calling for help. Something in the nervous system responds before rational thought catches up, but as my hand hovered near the latch, the notebook on the desk snapped shut with a sound like a slap. The air in the cottage tightened instantly, the way a room feels when someone suddenly inhales sharply in fear. The lamp flame thinned, retreating into a trembling blue thread. The walls expanded inward a fraction of an inch, the wood creaking as if the house itself had taken a step closer. Another voice rose from the cliffs, not my voice, lower, wet, thick with brine. It spoke the same name, but differently elongated, stretched across the rocks as though filtered through water. Then the first voice returned, my voice, calling the name again, layering itself over the second, like two versions of a tape playing out of sync, like two things competing for clarity, like two presences circling a single identity. Something in my throat constricted. I stepped away from the door. The creatures, if that word even applied, were not trying to lure me. They were trying to see which version of me I answered to. Wind swept across the island, sharp, sudden, almost violent. The lighthouse's glass shuddered. The light flickered, then steadied in a thin, cold beam that swept across the fog. The beam moved slowly, searching, and each time it passed over the cliffs, the voices paused. Not silenced, paused, as if waiting for the light to move on. The presence beneath the floorboards shifted again, heavier now, closer to the center of the room. I took another step backward until my spine pressed into the far wall. My hand brushed the old photograph of Rowan Hale, the printed image of him standing at the cliff edge, blurred at the shoulders, eyes unfocused, looking just slightly away from the camera. I lifted the frame with trembling hands. Rowan's face wasn't blurry because of age or damage. It was blurry because Rowan was moving when the photograph was taken, moving toward the camera, moving toward whoever took the picture, moving toward the person he thought he saw, someone who looked like him. A shudder traveled through my ribs. A wet dragging noise pulled my attention back to the floor. Something beneath the cottage was rising, not through the boards, not breaching, but aligning itself, positioning, learning where I stood. The voice outside called my name again, sharper now, perfect in pitch, an exact replica of how I sounded when I answered the phone, how I sounded in academic interviews, how I sounded introducing myself to strangers. It should have been impossible. I hadn't spoken since arriving on this island, so how did it know? The wind died again. The ocean stilled. The entire island leaned into silence. Then, a soft knock at the door. 3 gentle taps, not seeking entry, seeking acknowledgement. I froze. My hand tightened around the frame so hard the wood creaked. The knock came again. Same rhythm, same softness, like someone who knew me well enough not to frighten me. Only Rowan would have knocked like that, and Rowan had been gone for 52 years. A tremor worked its way up my spine as the third knock sounded, but this time, from the window, directly behind me. I turned slowly, the lamp flickering wildly as my movement disturbed the air. The window pane was fully fogged over now, a perfect sheet of condensation. A shape pressed against it from the outside, vague, tall, unsteady in outline. I told myself not to look, I told myself the notebook warned me not to. I looked anyway. The fog shifted just slightly where the shape leaned into the glass, and beneath that shifting haze, a face began to form, not pressed against the pane, not visible through it. No, a reflection, my reflection, but not mirroring me. Its posture was wrong, its head tilted at a predatory angle, its eyes darker than mine widened with eerie recognition. As I leaned in, breath trembling, the reflection raised a hand, but I did not. The reflection smiled, but I did not. My throat tightened with a cold, oceanic dread, thick and hollow, the kind of fear that sinks rather than spikes. Then, from the cliff below, the voice called my name again, perfectly, flawlessly, with warmth, a human warmth, my warmth. I backed away from the window, and the reflection's smile widened, slow and knowing, before fading into the fog like breath dissolving on cold glass. I felt the island shift. I felt the lighthouse's hum tighten like a muscle. I felt something beneath the cottage lean upward, toward me. The notebook on the desk snapped open again. A new line bled across the page. The one calling from below isn't you. Another line formed, slower, almost sorrowful. The one at the window is. And just as the island fell into an impossible silence, the last message wrote itself, ink bleeding like seawater through paper. You are becoming the keeper. The lamp guttered. The light wavered. The cottage breathed in. And from outside, at the door, came one final, soft knock. My knock, perfectly timed, perfectly me. The final knock at the door was softer than any that had come before it, gentle, almost polite. It sounded like someone trying not to startle me, someone who believed I would eventually open the door if given enough time, enough space, enough quiet to understand. For a long while, I didn't move. I stood in the center of the cottage with my hands curled at my sides, the lamplight fluttering like a nervous heartbeat in the darkened room. The walls leaned closer. The floor pulsed with a slow, tidal breath, and outside, the island held its silence with the patience of something ancient. A second knock came, same rhythm, same softness, same me. The window fogged over completely, turning the glass into a pale, featureless membrane. My reflection no longer appeared at all, just the faint hint of a face-shaped void where the condensation had thinned, as if something outside stood too close for the fog to form evenly. Don't answer it. The thought wasn't my own. It felt like it belonged to the notebook, or the lighthouse, or perhaps the island itself. But the door's old metal latch quivered as another knock whispered through it, and something instinctive tugged me forward, some old, primal part of the mind that responds to hearing one's own voice speak from the dark. I approached, slowly, stopping just shy of touching the wood. My breath fogged the air between me and the door in a trembling cloud. Then, from far down the cliff path, my name echoed again. Not perfect this time, not flawless, but pleading, human, warm, almost familiar in the way sunlight is familiar after weeks of clouded sky. Two voices, two versions of me, one on the cliff, one at the door. My heart thudded slowly, painfully, as the realization formed like ice inside my chest. Only one of them needed me to open the door. The other needed me to leave the cottage, and neither of them were me. The lamp flickered once, a thin, terrified pulse, before going out. Darkness swallowed the cottage. The air seemed to grow heavier, thick with salt and the faint odor of wet stone. Beneath the floorboards, something shifted again, not crawling this time, not creeping, but rising, as if the earth below the cottage were made of pliant, yielding flesh. I backed away from the door, hands searching the wall for the lamp. In the dark, my fingertips brushed against the wooden frame of Rowan Hale's photograph. When I lifted it, it felt heavier than before. The weight didn't come from the frame. It came from the image inside it. I brought the picture near the window's faint glow. Rowan stood at the cliff in the photo, coat whipping with the wind, face half turned. But something had changed since the last time I looked. His blurred outline had sharpened. And now, Rowan's gaze was not turned away from the camera. Rowan was looking directly at me. His eyes were hollowed with saltwater shadows, dark crescents that looked almost bruised. His lips were parted slightly, as though he were about to speak, and beneath the faint discoloration of the old print, I saw something else, something that made my blood run cold. A second figure stood behind Rowan, faded, tall, blurred, leaning close to his ear, its outline far too long, far too thin. And Rowan's shadow, the one cast at his feet, no longer matched the shape of his body. I let the frame slip from my fingers. It cracked on the floor. A wet whisper crept through the cracks in the floorboards. Then a long, slow exhale rose from beneath the cottage. Not human, not entirely. Something learning to sound human. I stumbled back. My shoulder struck the desk, knocking both notebooks open. Their pages fluttered violently as if caught in a wind that wasn't present. Ink bubbled in the margins, bleeding into new words. He replaced Rowan. Another line tore into the page. He kept the reflection, and then, shakier, fainter, carved with pressure rather than ink. He only needs yours now. I swallowed hard. The cottage door latch clicked again, but this time not from knocking, from the weight leaning against it. A low, fluid scrape swept down the length of the door frame, displacing wet moss outside. It sounded as though someone were dragging both hands designed for water, not wood, along the surface. My pulse roared in my ears. Something inside me broke into cold panic. Enough, I whispered. Enough, as if the island itself might listen, as if the sea might show mercy. The next knock was louder, still gentle, still deliberate, but urgent. The window beside me trembled. A shape pressed against it, flattening something soft and webbed against the condensation. A hint of an eye, dark, depthless, peered through the fog. Another knock, then a low, wet whisper. Open? I stumbled backward, boots scraping across old wooden planks. My body shuddered with each breath. The walls closed in. The air tasted like brine. The lighthouse hum vibrated through the floor. And then, from the path beyond the cottage, my voice called out again. Help! Hey! Is someone there? I need help! The human warmth in the voice was unmistakable, so familiar, so perfect. But I knew, in a sudden, icy clarity, that both voices were lies, because something else had changed. The lighthouse light flickered again, once, twice, before flaring bright enough to cast a long reflection against the cottage window. And in that brief gleam, I saw myself standing outside, soaking wet, coat clinging to my arms like drenched skin, eyes blackened like hollow tide pools, head tilted in that too fluid way, like a creature testing the fit of a new body. The reflection faded with the light, and a soft, almost sympathetic tapping began on the window. Slow, measured, reassuring. I backed into the corner of the cottage, trembling violently. The notebook's pages turned again, one last time, revealing a single line in a hand I recognized now as Rowan's. If you hear your name, it's already inside. The floor creaked behind me. The breath at my neck wasn't my own. I turned and saw me standing in the doorway of the bedroom, clothes dripping, salt water streaming from my hair, eyes reflecting the lantern room's light in a way no human eyes could. But the door had never opened. No hinges had groaned. Nothing had stepped inside. It had been here, inside the cottage, inside the floorboards, inside the walls, inside the reflection, learning me, becoming me. My voice came from its mouth. You took too long. The cottage walls sighed inward. The roof groaned. The light from the lighthouse dimmed. And before the island swallowed the last of the living warmth, before the sea chose which face to keep, I understood the truth. Rowan Hale had never disappeared. Not really. Someone else had walked out of the lighthouse wearing his face, and now someone else was going to walk off this island wearing mine. Story 4. The desert always had a way of swallowing sound, but that night, on the forgotten stretch of old Route 11, it felt as though the silence had been waiting for me specifically, stretching itself thin across the sand and the cracked asphalt, like a patient animal preparing to study the shape of my footsteps. I remember gripping the wheel with both hands, my knuckles stiff beneath the thin glow of the dashboard. The radio's static, hissing like a long exhale from some distant metallic lung as the strip of dying highway unfurled under my headlights. I had been driving for nearly 18 hours, with nowhere to stop, because the newer interstate was closed by a pileup, and dispatch told us long haulers to use the old road if needed. Though nobody had said that. The old road was hardly more than a memory. A scar across the desert floor that time didn't bother healing. Fatigue clung to my skull like a damp cloth, my eyeballs dry and gritty, my thoughts floating around in loose, heavy spirals that felt more dreamlike than conscious, and every bump in the asphalt seemed to knock something loose behind my ribs. Around me, the Nevada desert stretched into an infinite dark plain, the horizon swallowed by a sheet of moonless night so thick it looked almost liquid. And each mile marker that appeared in the headlights seemed older, more rust-eaten, more bleached than the one before, as though I were moving backward through someone else's timeline instead of my own. The temperature dropped with a suddenness that made the skin on my arms prickle, and the faint smell of hot dust gave way to something colder, metallic, almost electric. A scent that reminded me faintly of the air inside a server room, or the ozone after lightning strikes an artificial cold in a place that should have retained heat long after sunset. Sometime around midnight, my eyelids began to twitch with the strain of staying open, and I told myself I'd stop at the next turnout, though even as I formed the thought I knew turnouts didn't exist on old Route 11 anymore. Not since the new highway stole the traffic and left this one to dry out in the sun. I leaned forward in the seat, squinting through the windshield, and that was when I saw it, a shape in the distance glowing faintly in my high beams, a pale block of something half hidden by the drifting sand, not large enough to be a building, but too structured to be rock. As I drew closer, the desert wind shifted, pushing thin waves of sand off the road and revealing the outline of an old service station, a forgotten way station from decades earlier, its roof bowed inward, its cracked sign hanging from a single rusted bolt, the faded ghost of a fuel price unreadable, beneath layers of wind-polished dust. The gas pumps stood like gravestones, rigid and silent, shadows pooling at their bases where desert insects had piled over the years. I told myself I'd only pull over for a moment to splash cold water on my face, to stretch my legs, but as soon as I cut the engine, the headlights dimmed into a thick, predatory darkness, and the world around me seemed to inhale, as if relieved I had finally stopped moving. I stepped out of the truck into the cool night air, my boots crunching softly on the thin crust of sand, the silence pressing so heavily against my ears that my own breathing sounded unnaturally loud, each inhale rasping across my throat like dry paper. The desert stretched outward on all sides in an unbroken ring of black, and the sky above looked devoid of stars, as if clouds had formed a silent ceiling. Though there were no clouds, only a vast, empty dome of darkness. I walked toward the station, feeling the desert floor shift slightly beneath the soles of my boots as my weight disturbed long-settled layers of sand. The air smelled faintly of creosote and long-dead machinery, a metallic tang that seemed to cling to my tongue. Then, as I reached the broken doorway of the station's convenience store, something caught the corner of my vision. A small, perfect circle of darkness on the ground near my truck's front tire, a black spot the size of a fist, so dark it looked like a hole burned straight through the world. I crouched down, rubbing my eyes, telling myself it was fatigue or shadow or oil, but the closer I leaned, the more I realized it was not any of those things, because within that circle was not blackness, but an absence, a complete void, a darkness with edges too clean, too sharp, too deliberate, as if someone had cut a piece of night out of the sky and pasted it onto the ground. I blinked hard, rubbed my face, shook my head like a man trying to rattle loose a hallucination. But when I looked again, the spot was still there, as precise and unmoving as before, and that was when I noticed the faintest vibration beneath my boots, a soft, rhythmic thrum, like the heartbeat of the road itself, pulsing with a slow awareness that made my chest tighten. The desert wind fell silent, the air thickened, and for the first time since I'd left the interstate, I felt not alone. but watched not by a creature or a person, but by the road, by the dark ribbon of Route 11 stretching back into the night, as though it were a living thing waiting for me to acknowledge it. I stood there in the thick desert, quiet, staring at that impossible black spot, and as the cold crept up my spine, I realized with terrible clarity that the road had not merely been abandoned. It had been left behind, like a memory too heavy to carry, and I had wandered into it like a man stepping into someone else's dream, unaware that dreams have ways of remembering us long after we wake. The moment I realized I had been staring at the black spot for so long that my breath had turned thin and unsteady in my chest, the desert air seemed to shift around me in a way that felt almost corrective, as if the night itself was reminding me to breathe before it claimed the last bit of awareness I had left. And when I finally forced air back into my lungs, the coldness of it hit with such sharp clarity that it almost hurt. A shock of winter-like chill in a place that should have still held the day's warmth, and the sensation made the small hairs on my arms rise with a primal recognition that whatever I had been looking at was not a trick of fatigue, nor the harmless shadow of a truck's headlights, but something that did not belong to the physical world I trusted, something that sat in front of me with the same uneasy confidence as an animal that knows it does not need to move to be noticed. Then that realization pushed me to take one step back, then another, without ever letting my gaze fully break from the perfectly circular void in the sand. But even as I backed away, something strange and disorienting unraveled in my perception. No matter how many feet I placed between myself and the black spot, no matter how far the arc of my retreat widened, the distance between my body and that circle of impossible darkness did not seem to change, as if the road had bent space around it like a lens, bending light, warping perspective so thoroughly that proximity became an illusion or perhaps a choice made by the spot itself rather than by me. And the more I registered that uncanny lack of spatial logic, the more a thick, metallic chill crept up the back of my throat, coating my tongue with the taste of cold electricity, the kind that lingers after a lightning strike too close for comfort. I wanted to run back to the truck, slam the door shut, and roar off into the night, no matter which direction the headlights pointed. But some heavy, weary part of my mind, the part softened by 18 hours of driving without rest, and the endless sameness of the desert kept me rooted there, kept me staring, kept me believing that maybe if I simply observed long enough, the thing would reveal its purpose, its shape, its truth, because surely something that wrong must eventually betray the rules it hides behind. And then, as if summoned by the slow collapse of my judgment, the wind shifted again, sliding a colder current across the cracked pavement, a current that felt less like natural airflow and more like a quiet inhalation made by something waiting just beyond the boundaries of sight. And that was when I noticed the structure at the far edge of the old service station, a phone booth, standing upright like an artifact preserved from a time when the road still mattered, its glass panes fogged with a thin veil of moisture despite the air at night, its metal frame surprisingly uncorroded, almost pristine compared to the sagging roof of the convenience store beside it, a structure that looked as though one good storm would flatten it back into the sand. The booth's presence felt wrong in the same quiet way the black spot felt wrong, not because it was sinister in appearance, but because it looked too intact, too untouched by the decades that had eroded everything else on Route 11, as if it had been placed here after the rest of the station had died, as if it had been waiting specifically for someone like me who had driven too far into the night without enough sleep to guard the mind. Something in my chest tightened as I approached it, the crunch of sand under my boots seeming to echo more loudly than it should have, amplifying the dryness of the air. And when I came close enough to press my palm against the glass, the surface felt cool and damp, the kind of dampness that comes from a warm breath lingering on the inside of a surface rather than the chill of desert air outside, as though someone had stood there moments before I arrived, exhaling softly, leaving behind the last trace of their presence. I pushed the door open, and the metal hinges produced a thin, nearly apologetic squeal, a sound that carried the weight of long disuse, even though the booth itself did not appear aged enough for such decay. And as I stepped inside, the air shifted instantly, becoming denser, quieter, and carrying with it the faint smell of old paper, static electricity, and something like engine oil left sitting in the sun, an impossible combination for a sealed booth in the middle of a dead service station. And then I saw it, a small notebook, lying on the floor near the base of the metal stand where the telephone once hung, the handset missing and leaving behind a severed coil of frayed wire, and the notebook itself, thick, soft at the corners, wrapped in a cover of darkened leather that looked worn but not fragile, as if many hands had held it but none had allowed it to decay completely. The moment I picked it up, I was struck by its weight, heavier than it looked, much heavier, as though the pages carried not just words but something else, perhaps the density of time or the pressure of memory. And when I opened the first page, the handwriting I saw was tremulous yet deliberate, the kind made by someone writing through exhaustion or anxiety, the loops uneven, the lines wavering ever so slightly. And at the top of the page, centered and underlined, was a heading that made my skin tighten. Log 1. Do not look at the black spots for too long. Not because they look back, but because they trade places with your shadow. The sentence hit me like a blow to the chest, a sudden jolt of recognition, and my breath caught in a shallow gasp that I tried to swallow down as I turned the next page, reading faster than my mind could fully absorb, finding descriptions that mirrored the exact sensations I had just experienced. The exhaustion of night driving that erodes the boundary between the mind and the road. The illusion of shadows where none should be. The first appearance of a small spot. Then 2, then a dozen, all forming perfect circles that remained still even when the truck moved, even when the driver blinked, even when every reasonable part of the brain tried to explain them as retinal artifacts or patches of oil. The entries were dated from 1987, but the ink looked fresh, crisp, like it had been written that same evening. And as I flipped further, the tone of the writer shifted from confusion to dread, describing how the spots grew darker, sharper, more present, how they didn't seem to exist on the road but in it, embedded like flaws in reality's fabric rather than stains on the asphalt. How passing over one produced no sensation in the tires, no sound, no vibration, as though the wheels had momentarily exited the world. I kept reading, feeling the booth grow warmer with each breath, until sweat gathered at the nape of my neck. Not from heat, but from the claustrophobic realization that the entries were not the ramblings of a man succumbing to highway hallucinations, but a systematic cataloging of phenomena he did not understand, but could not escape. And halfway down one page, I found a line that made my knees weaken. Log 7. The spots are not ahead of me. They are the ahead. They are the anchor points marking where the road loops back on itself. Each time I pass one, I feel the strange, nauseating certainty that I am returning to a moment I never left. The booth felt smaller, tighter, the walls closing in, the glass fogging over with condensation that could only have been coming from me or from something that had been here moments before, and because I felt the desert shift outside, the heaviness in the air like the universe was drawing a breath before speaking, I turned to the next page with a trembling hand. The entry read, Log 11. I thought I turned the wheel. I swear I remember turning it. But the odometer climbed as if I did nothing at all. I have been traveling one direction for so long that I think the road has replaced the idea of turning. I don't know which way I face anymore. I don't know if this is still night or if night has followed me specifically. Sweat trickled down my spine in a slow, icy line, and I licked my dry lips, tasting the dust of old paper and something faintly metallic, as if the air in the booth was infused with iron filings. And just before I closed the notebook, some morbid curiosity pulled my eyes to the next page, where the handwriting grew sloppier, words leaning at strange angles like the writer had no time to balance each line. And the final entry was scrawled with such shaky desperation that the letters bled into each other. Log 12. I met another driver. He stood in the middle of the road, 300 miles from the first black spot. I thought he needed help, but when I approached, I saw he was wearing my clothes, my jacket, my shoes, my hands, and he told me I'd been driving here for 30 years. Something cold and hollow opened beneath my ribs, and I felt the desert go silent in a way that did not feel natural or even meteorological, but deliberate, as if the night had been listening to me read, waiting for me to reach this exact line before it exhaled a new truth into the world. I tried to shut the notebook, but my hand, either through dread or some darker inertia, flipped to one last page, where only a single sentence was written. The ink smudged, the pressure of the pen cutting lightly through the paper. If you are reading this, then the next black spot has already chosen you as its new anchor. And in the thickening silence of that phone booth, I felt the world tilt almost imperceptibly. Not enough to unbalance my stance, but enough that my inner ear caught the shift, telling me something fundamental had changed outside. I slowly turned my head toward the fogged glass pane, and through the condensation I saw, with a clarity that ripped through me like a razor of cold wind, that another black spot had appeared on the ground beside my truck. Larger, darker, impossibly round, and undeniably recent, sitting in a place I knew with absolute certainty had been empty minutes before, and in the moment I registered it, I felt a small, tight pulse of something deep beneath my feet, as though the desert floor itself had a heartbeat, and that heartbeat was syncing with mine, matching my breath, matching the tension in my lungs, matching the slow collapse of rational thought, until I understood that I was no longer simply standing on a road, but inside the memory of a road that had forgotten where it led, a road that needed someone to remember it, a road that used those black spots as compass points to pull the tired, the lonely, the restless, the sleepless into its loop, into its logic, into its hunger. I stepped out of the phone booth with the notebook still clutched in my hand, the weight of it pressing into my palm like a second pulse, an unfamiliar rhythm beating against my skin as if the pages themselves were breathing in the thin desert air. And the moment my boots sank into the sand again, I felt the world shift with a subtle shudder that had nothing to do with wind or movement, but something deeper. A slow tectonic rearrangement beneath the surface of reality, as though the desert floor had exhaled in recognition of me, acknowledging my presence on a level I was not equipped to understand. The sky above, which had been merely dark before, now looked impossibly hollow, not empty, but scooped clean of stars, as though the night had peeled back its celestial layer and revealed a raw, vacant shell of atmosphere that stretched out endlessly without offering anything to anchor the eye, forcing my gaze back down to the ground where the newest black spot sat, unwavering and perfectly round beside the truck's front wheel, darker than any shadow could be, darker than absence itself, in a void so complete it felt like my consciousness slid toward it the way water runs downhill, and I became aware, with a rising dread that settled into my bones like a slow frost, that the longer I stared at it, the more the edges of the world around it seemed to bend inward, not physically but perceptually, as though the black spot was not simply residing on the road but rewriting the landscape around it, pulling all attention toward itself like a gravitational sinkhole or the pupil of some unseen eye observing me from beneath the asphalt. I tore my gaze away only by force, my jaw clenched so tightly that a dull ache radiated up toward my temples. And as my eyes lifted to the horizon, I saw the long stretch of old Route 11 merge seamlessly into a darkness so uniform it gave no indication of distance or direction, no differentiation between the sky and the desert, no lines to separate the past from the present, and in the far distance, barely visible through the wavering distortions of heat that rose inexplicably off the pavement despite the cold air, I thought I saw the faint glimmer of more black spots, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each one pulsing gently in the dimness, like distant beacons marking a path or a boundary, though whether the path led inward or outward, or nowhere at all, was impossible to determine. The silence around me was no longer the simple void of nighttime in remote places, but something intentional, oppressive, a silence that pressed against the eardrums with the steady pressure of deep water, making my own heartbeat sound amplified and foreign, the thumping echoing through my skull like the footsteps of something enormous, pacing silently beside me, just beyond the reach of perception. I tried to focus, to pull myself back into the present moment, but the desert wavered in a way that made time itself feel loose, as though the seconds were stretching, pooling, slipping out of order. And when I looked down at my watch, the numbers on the digital face seemed unsteady, the minutes refusing to advance in any consistent rhythm, instead appearing to flicker forward and backward between the same two digits, as if the watch had given up on linear time and was now trying to approximate whatever temporal logic the road obeyed. I forced myself to move, each step heavy, as if the air had become thick and resistant around my legs, the sand swallowing my weight with a disturbing softness. And as I approached the truck, I noticed something I had not seen before, something that made the skin along my spine contract tightly. The odometer reading, which should have been static since I had not driven since parking, had increased, not by a mile or a tenth of a mile, but by several hundred miles, numbers climbing without the truck ever moving, as though the vehicle had continued traveling even while parked, carrying a version of me forward while I remained behind. Or perhaps carrying the idea of me down a stretch of road that did not require physical presence. A wave of dizziness washed over me, my vision blurring momentarily as if the world had sloshed sideways, and I had to grip the door frame of the truck to steady myself, my fingers digging into the cold metal until sensation slowly returned. The desert beyond the station hummed faintly, a vibration too soft to be heard, but felt through the soles of my boots like the subsonic tremor of a faraway engine. And I realized that even though there were no vehicles, no wind, no wildlife, nothing at all to create such a sound, the road itself was humming, a low, continuous frequency that seemed to resonate within the bones of the earth, an ancient and exhausted sound, like the inhalation of something trying to remember how to breathe. I tried to think logically, to remind myself that fatigue could cause distortions, that sleep deprivation could create auditory hallucinations and visual disturbances, but the notebook's weight in my hand made that explanation feel ridiculously, painfully insufficient, because the entries I had read contained too many details, too many specific sensations that matched my own, too many descriptions that aligned perfectly with the impossible phenomena unfolding around me, and the more I tried to dismiss them, the more I felt that terrible, creeping certainty that I had not discovered something new but stepped into a pattern that had been running long before I arrived, a pattern waiting for me the same way it had waited for the writer of the journal, and perhaps many others before him. I forced myself to walk away from the phone booth toward the main building of the abandoned station, hoping movement might shake loose the thick fog of dread gathering behind my eyes. But with each step I felt the world deform subtly, the distance between the booth and the building seeming to fluctuate, sometimes stretching impossibly long as though the desert floor were lengthening beneath me, sometimes shrinking abruptly so that I nearly stumbled into the doorway without realizing how close I had come. And when I placed my hand on the wooden frame of the entrance, the wood felt warm, unnaturally warm, as if the station had somehow retained the body heat of someone who had been standing there only seconds before, though I had seen no one, heard no one. Inside, the air was cooler, carrying the stale scent of sand, oil, and time, and the dim moonlight filtering through the broken window cast elongated shadows across the cracked tiles, shadows that seemed to ripple at the edges, not in response to wind, but as though they were breathing, expanding and contracting with a steady rhythm that did not match the movement of the environment. I stood motionless for what felt like several minutes, listening to my own heartbeat echo in my ears, trying to decide whether the rhythm I heard was mine or some deeper pulse resonating up through the worn floor tiles. And eventually my eyes drifted back toward the open doorway, where the newest black spot remained visible from inside the shop, a perfect circle of void that seemed to grow imperceptibly larger each time I blinked, expanding the way a drop of ink spreads through water, not quickly but inevitably. And with that observation came a sudden and horrifying understanding. The road was not simply marking itself, nor was it merely observing those who traveled it for too long. The road was choosing, selecting, absorbing, folding travelers into itself the way a dying organism folds nutrients into its bloodstream, using the black spots as entry points or anchors, or perhaps even as replacements for something it had lost. I felt cold all over, the desert night pressing against my skin with the intimacy of a hand sliding down my spine, and I realized with a clarity that bordered on panic that the silence around me had become too consistent, too absolute, the kind of silence that is not the absence of noise but the presence of something waiting beneath it. And I knew, in the marrow of my bones, that I had crossed a point on this road from which turning back might no longer be possible, not because I lacked the will, but because the road itself had already begun to weave me into its logic, into its memory, into its hunger. And somewhere in the dark, beyond the visible horizon, I felt a faint recognition bloom, as if something out there, Something patient, something vast had become aware of me in the same moment I became aware of it. And in that mutual recognition lay a truth more terrifying than any creature, or ghost, or hallucination. The road remembered those who noticed it, and it kept what it remembered. I do not know how long I stood inside the abandoned service station, only that at some point the subtle vibration under the floor rose into a slow, insistent hum that settled into my bones like a second heartbeat, and the longer I remained there, the more I felt the edges of my own thoughts begin to soften and drift, as though the desert night were dissolving the barrier between mind and environment, blending my perception into the same thick, stagnant air that clung to the cracked tile floor. Eventually, I stepped back out into the open, the weight of the journal still pulling at my hand like an anchor trying to tether me to a story I'd not yet finished reading. But the moment my boots touched the sand again, I sensed something different in the air, a slight alteration in pressure, a new heaviness in the night that did not belong to weather or fatigue but to presence, as though another consciousness had entered the stretch of old Route 11 without making a sound. And at first I told myself it was only the wind shifting direction, though the wind had not blown for nearly an hour, and the desert remained unnervingly still. The sky had grown darker, impossibly darker, the horizon dissolving into a uniform blanket of blackness. The blackness so complete it reminded me of the smooth, lightless hollows inside the black spots themselves. And for one chilling moment I had the distinct sensation that the sky was watching me with the same level, indifferent scrutiny as the voids in the pavement, examining the smallness of my existence against its vast, empty canvas. I forced my gaze downward, letting it slip back toward the newest black spot near my truck. And though I knew rationally that it should not have changed, that it should have remained the same exact size and shape as before, I could not shake the feeling that it had grown just a fraction, a near imperceptible expansion like the slow spread of frost across a window or the widening of a pupil in the dark. And the realization struck me with a sudden, primal fear that the spot was not merely marking the road but actively responding to me, adjusting itself in accordance with my presence, stretching its edges in anticipation or recognition. And in that moment, a subtle but unmistakable movement flickered at the boundary of my peripheral vision. My body tensed instantly, the muscles in my shoulders tightening as though bracing for impact, and when I turned my head slowly, cautiously, I saw a figure standing at the far edge of the service station's lot, half shrouded in darkness, just beyond the fractured circle of my headlights, not approaching but simply standing there with the stillness of a statue carved from the night itself. And the sight of that figure triggered something deep and instinctive inside me, a cold tightening in the center of my chest that felt like the delayed recognition of danger, the kind of fear that arrives a moment after the predator has already taken notice. The silhouette was tall, lean, its posture slightly tilted forward as though listening to the ground or perhaps to me. And even from a distance, even through the thick darkness, I could tell the figure was not a stranger. Something about its outline, the angle of its shoulders, the way its hands hung loosely at its sides, felt horribly familiar, and the familiarity triggered a memory I tried to ignore. The final entry in the journal, the desperate scrawl describing a driver encountered on this same road, a driver who wore the same clothes, the same boots, the same face. I held my breath without meaning to, the silence stretching around me like the tightening skin of a drum, and for a moment I entertained the fleeting hope that the figure was an illusion, a hallucination born from exhaustion, a mental projection conjured by darkness and fear. But then the figure shifted only slightly, only enough for one foot to slide forward in the sand. But that small motion was enough to dispel any comforting delusion, because the step was too controlled, too deliberate, too synchronized with the subtle hum under the ground, almost as though the figure was not moving independently, but in harmony with the pulse of the road itself. It stepped closer, emerging by inches into the faint reach of my headlights, and my breath froze in my throat as the light brushed the edge of its coat. A coat identical to mine in color, in length, in wear. The same frayed hem I had torn 2 months earlier on a loading dock. The same faint stain of engine grease on the right sleeve. My heartbeat hammered against my ribs with such force that I could feel it in my teeth, and the moment the figure lifted its head enough for the pale glow of the headlights to graze its face, I felt the world tilt sharply beneath me, because the face that looked back at me distant, expressionless, half-shaped by shadow, was my own. Not a reflection, not a coincidence, but a perfect replica, carved in darkness and dust. A version of me that should not exist. A version that the road itself had shaped or stolen or remembered across the decades. For one long moment the desert stood absolutely still, the figure unmoving, the black spot beside my truck humming faintly with an almost eager vibration. And in that shared silence something clicked together in my mind, like two gears aligning. The road did not simply trap drivers in loops of time. It did not merely confuse their sense of direction or warp their memories. The road replicated them, copied them, replaced them, created an echo or a counterpart or a remnant that walked outward into the world while the original driver remained behind, dissolving slowly into the dark miles of desert until their body and mind and memory became indistinguishable from the asphalt that consumed them. My figure took another step forward, and something in its movement made my vision blur for a moment, not because the figure was distorted, but because I was losing the ability to perceive where I ended and it began, as though the road were gently peeling the boundary between us, merging two timelines, two identities, two versions of the same existence into one narrative thread it could manipulate. The hum under my feet deepened into a low, resonant thrum, and though the figure had stopped moving, its presence filled the air like a pressure system rolling in off the ocean, heavy and oppressive. And in that pressure I felt something like a memory that was not mine, an image of headlights cutting through a night much like this one, a hand gripping a steering wheel until the knuckles went white, the smell of overheating brakes, the sound of someone calling out into the desert only to hear their own voice answer back from a distance, the taste of dust and metal in their mouth, and the slow, sinking dread of realizing the horizon never came closer, no matter how far they drove. The memory swelled inside me like water rising in a narrow room, thick and suffocating, and when I blinked, the figure had stopped just 20 feet away, perfectly still, its head tilted slightly, its eyes reflecting the glare of my headlights with a dull, glassy sheen that made them look less like human eyes and more like the dew-covered lenses of an insect. And in its unmoving posture there was a calmness so absolute that it felt like inevitability incarnate. I stumbled backward instinctively, my boots dragging through the sand, and as I moved the figure mirrored me, not quickly, not like a mockery, but with a patient, measured precision, as though testing the boundaries of my fear, calibrating its movements to match mine, learning me the way the road had learned the footsteps of the journal's author, the way it had learned countless others before us. A faint quiver rippled through the shadows at the figure's feet, and for a moment the outline of its body flickered like the wavering image on an old videotape, distorting at the edges as though the reality that held it together was unstable or incomplete. And in that flicker I saw, just for an instant, the hint of other shapes behind it, other silhouettes standing in perfect stillness along the edges of the road. Dozens of them, maybe more, frozen in the darkness like echoes of drivers who had once walked this same stretch of Route 11, echoes that the road had replicated, preserved, and kept as markers for its own looping chronology. The sight of those shapes made something in me break open, a cold, final recognition that no matter how far I drove, no matter how fast I ran, I had already been absorbed into the logic of this place, and the road was no longer simply observing me. It was preparing me, shaping me, memorizing me, so it could release a version of me back into the world, while the rest of me remained behind, wandering its endless loop, until I too became one of the silent silhouettes waiting in the dark. My figure took one last step toward me, and though I could not hear its footsteps, I felt each one as a vibration in the ground, a pulse in the air, a subtle rearrangement of time itself, and as it stopped only a few feet away, close enough that I could see the faint rise and fall of its chest in a slow, unnatural rhythm, I understood at last why the journal's author had written that haunting, desperate warning: the road does not trap you in order to kill you. It traps you in order to keep you, to learn you, to duplicate you. to digest you into the fabric of its own memory, so that the driver who walks away is not the one who arrived, but the one the road chooses to release. And as my legs trembled and the air thinned around me, I knew, without understanding how I knew, that my replacement had already stepped out of the dark and was waiting for me to accept what the road had decided. The desert did not move, the air did not shift, the figure that wore my face did not blink, and yet every part of the world seemed to rearrange itself around the simple fact of its presence, as though the moment it stepped toward me the boundaries of reality began to pull inward like fabric shrinking in heat, tightening the space between us until the night felt too narrow to hold two versions of the same man. And I sensed in some quiet chamber of my instincts that the road had reached the point. In its long, patient ritual where the exchange could not be undone, I backed away slowly, sand dragging under my soles like a riverbed resisting my retreat, but no matter how far I moved the distance between me and the figure remained constant, its steps not matching mine but syncing with the shifting of the black spots across the asphalt, as though it were tethered not to me directly but to the road's perception of me. A more permanent and authoritative source than my own senses could ever hope to be, and the sensation that something behind my eyes had begun to loosen, like a tether pulling free from its anchor, made my breath shudder out of rhythm, as if the simple act of inhaling was no longer entirely under my control. Overhead, the sky seemed to ripple with a faint vibration that didn't come from wind or temperature or movement but from time itself, a strange atmospheric pulse that made the darkness look layered, almost fluid, like the surface of a deep ocean seen from below. And in those undulating folds of sky I saw faint impressions of headlights from some other decade, flickers of chrome and glass and glimpses of faces long dissolved into the road's memory, all drifting in the air like trapped bubbles rising toward a surface they could never reach. The figure that mirrored me shifted again, just a tilt of the head, a slight recalibration of posture, but the subtlety made the movement more horrifying. Because nothing alive moves with that kind of precision except things that have been practicing for a very long time, and I felt, with a dread that hollowed out everything inside my chest, that the figure had been waiting to perfect this posture, this stance, this exact replication of my presence, not tonight, not in the minutes since I had arrived, but for years, perhaps decades, matching itself to the shape of every tired driver who had ever stepped into the soft gravity of the black spots. The hum under the ground deepened into something almost melodic. A long subterranean resonance that felt like a memory returning rather than a sound being produced, and the air thickened in my lungs as the black spot beside my truck began to widen again, not quickly, not with any frantic motion, but with the slow, inevitable expansion of something that did not need speed to express intention, and watching that expansion I realized that the spot did not grow randomly. It grew in direct proportion to my fear, its edges responding to the tremors in my hands and the uneven cadence of my heartbeat, as though it were measuring me, calibrating itself around me, preparing to draw me inward the way a mouth shapes itself around a familiar taste. The figure stepped to the side, the movement so fluid it made my stomach turn, and for a moment my headlights illuminated its silhouette just enough for me to see the faint gleam of moisture on its clothes, a sheen of something that was not water but time. Time condensed, time liquefied, time clinging to its sleeves. Like dew gathered from decades of repetition, the shadows behind it, once still, began to shift as well, countless silhouettes rising in the distance like rows of forgotten travelers standing shoulder to shoulder, each figure shaped in the rough outline of a person but lacking detail, as though the road remembered their bodies but not their faces, their stance but not their identity. And the sight of them triggered the nauseating realization that I was not witnessing ghosts or hallucinations, but the collected residue of the road's history, a parallel population of abandoned versions trapped in the loops of time that the black spots created. I stumbled backward until the cracked wooden siding of the service station pressed hard against my spine, anchoring me physically even as the world around me dissolved into a fluid continuum of time, and when my gaze dropped toward the ground I saw that another black spot had formed directly beneath my left boot, so faint at first it looked like the shadow of a cloud passing overhead. Except there were no clouds, no moon, nothing above to cast shadows. Only the road and its hunger, manifesting beneath me with the delicate precision of a surgeon marking the place where an incision would be made. I commanded my leg to move, to step out of the spot, but the instruction traveled through my body with agonizing slowness, as though my nervous system had begun to communicate through syrup instead of electricity, and by the time my foot finally responded, the spot had already widened enough that my instinctive retreat only caused me to sink deeper. into its perfectly circular gravity, not physically, not yet, but perceptually, as though part of my awareness had slipped and become lodged inside the dark center. A flicker of dizziness washed through me, not the dizziness of fatigue but the dizziness of losing a sense of direction in a place where direction itself had started to unravel, and I felt a sudden, terrifying certainty that my body was still here, standing on familiar sand, but my perception, the version of me that knew which way was forward, was being slowly drawn into that expanding void. The figure, now only a few yards away, extended one hand, not toward me but toward the spot, as if inviting it to complete its function, and I watched as the road responded to its motion, the hum synchronizing with its gesture, the black circle stretching outward like a breathing lung, and in that moment the desert landscape itself seemed to bow inward, bending slightly at the edges, a subtle but horrifying curvature that hinted at the true nature of the road. It was not a path laid across the land but a structure superimposed on time, a looped corridor of forgotten geography that fed on travelers who spent too long in its memory. I tried to shout, though no actual sound escaped my throat, because some instinct inside me understood that loud noise did not belong in this place, that the road had woven silence into its structure for a reason. And the moment I attempted to break it, my body responded with an overwhelming sensation of suffocation, as if the very air had forbidden me from interrupting the ritual. My knees buckled, and as I fell forward, catching myself on my hands, I felt the sand beneath my palms shift in a way that did not resemble sand at all but the soft, pliant give of something organic, something that pulsed faintly with the rhythm of the road's hum, and when I pulled my hand away, grains of sand clung to my skin like ash, blackened at the tips as though touched by the edges of the spot. The figure moved closer, and when its face finally entered the full light of my headlights, I felt my consciousness fracture, not because it looked different from me but because it did not in a superficial way, not in an uncanny imitation, but in the deeper, more horrifying sense that it possessed every detail of my face, including details I never consciously registered, the slight asymmetry of my jawline, the faint indentation from a childhood accident, even the exhaustion clouding my eyes. All copied with perfect fidelity as though it had been studying me not for hours but for years. And in that moment the final truth settled over me like the cold shadow of a passing cloud. The figure was not a replacement prepared for tonight, not a version constructed in my likeness, but the version that had always existed here, waiting in the loops of the road, waiting for me to arrive at the moment the road had designated, because the black spots did not choose randomly, and the road did not steal identities lightly. It was not creating a new driver to walk away into the world, it was putting back the driver that had left decades earlier, the driver whose absence had created a vacancy in the road's memory, a vacancy that I had unknowingly filled by stepping into this forgotten stretch of asphalt that fed on exhaustion and temporal drift. The figure lowered its hand, and I realized with a sharp, cold snap of awareness that the hum beneath my body had shifted from a rhythm of observation to a rhythm of completion, and the black spot that had begun beneath my boot now encompassed my entire shadow, a perfect silhouette cut from the outline of my body, a negative space waiting to be filled, and as the edges of the void rose gently like the swell of a tide, I felt myself slipping, not falling, not sinking, but dissolving, my sense of self peeling away like thin skin in dry heat, and I knew with absolute clarity that the road was not killing me, it was absorbing me, storing me, folding me into the endless archive of silhouettes that lined its memory, while the figure, the restored original, the one the road had kept all these years, stepped forward into the world to take the place I once thought was mine. The desert dimmed, the sky caved inward, and in the last fragment of consciousness that still belonged to me, I understood that the road had never been empty, never abandoned, never dangerous in the way people assumed. It was simply waiting, always waiting, for the next tired driver to wander off the new highway and into a place where time did not move forward but sideways, where footsteps were remembered long after people were forgotten, where identities came loose from their owners like dust shaken from old fabric, and as the world folded into blackness I felt the faint, distant echo of my own footsteps appearing beside the others in the dark corridor beneath the road, the corridor where all the remembered drivers lived forever, while somewhere behind me, in the real world, a truck engine started with familiar confidence, and a man wearing my face drove back toward the highway as though he had always been the one behind the wheel. Story 5. The House That Listened to the Rain. The rain was already falling by the time I turned off the highway and onto the narrow wooden bridge that led into the Louisiana bayou, a thin silver curtain spilling from a sky heavy with swollen clouds, and though the downpour had begun only minutes before my arrival, it covered the landscape with the kind of density and weight that made it seem as though it had been raining here for hours, maybe days. The smell of wet earth and decaying cypress saturating the air with a thickness that clung to my skin before I even stepped out of the car. The bridge groaned under the tires, each plank bending with the reluctance of old wood forced to carry one more burden, and the water beneath flowed in sluggish currents, dark as ink and streaked with clusters of duckweed that drifted aimlessly in slow, disjointed circles, their movement suggesting a deeper, unseen force stirring below, guiding them in loops that did not align with the direction of the rain or the wind. The house I had rented for the month, a tiny, weather-beaten structure raised on stilt-like wooden pilings, sat half-hidden behind draping veils of Spanish moss, its shutters cracked, its roof bowed in the way of things that survive not through resilience but stubbornness, and as my headlights swept across the front walkway, I saw the thin wooden planks glistening with a strange sheen that reminded me not just of wetness but of something more organic, as though the walkway's surface had absorbed centuries of moisture and now exhaled it back into the world whenever new rain arrived. I parked beneath the overhang, the engine ticking as it cooled, and stepped out into air so damp it felt like stepping into breath rather than atmosphere, and the first thing I noticed was the sound of the rain, not the typical percussion of droplets hitting roofs and leaves and water, but a layered, textured sound that seemed to move around the house with an unsettling intentionality, as if the rain were falling according to a pattern only the house could understand, each drop landing where it belonged, each stream sliding in deliberate pathways along the walls and windows, and the longer I listened, the more I felt as though the rain was not striking the house but being received by it, collected, interpreted, translated into something I could not yet decipher. The owner had warned me in a brief, clipped message that the shutter in the primary bedroom should never be closed, a warning I dismissed as eccentricity or perhaps a ventilation concern. But as I stepped onto the walkway, the wood flexing softly under my weight, I felt a faint tremor ripple through it, the kind of tremor that suggested something beneath was shifting in response to my arrival, and the sensation made the back of my neck prickle the way it does when stepping into a place with too much history to remain neutral about newcomers. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and when I pushed open the door, the interior air drifted around me with a mustiness that carried the scent of wet fabric, old books, and something faintly mineral, like stones pulled from deep water, and though the house was small, its shadowed corners seemed to draw inward in a way that suggested space did not behave normally here, expanding or contracting with the rhythm of the storm. I set my bags down near the entryway, the floorboards beneath me groaning in a low, resonant way that felt less like old wood complaining and more like some hollow chamber beneath the house responding to the shift in weight. And when I stepped deeper into the room, I felt the distinct sensation of being listened to, not watched, not studied, but listened to in the way one listens for distant thunder or approaching footsteps, with a still, heavy patience that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with recognition. The rain intensified outside, sheets of water sliding down the shutters and dripping from the moss overhead, and each sound seemed to come through the walls with a clarity that bordered on invasive, as though the house had no interest in shielding itself from the storm but rather absorbing it entirely, letting it soak into its beams and crawl across its joists like a second skin. I walked to the window, pressed my palm lightly to the frame, and felt a faint vibration travel up my arm, a gentle, rhythmic pulse that aligned perfectly with the pattern of the rainfall outside, and though I told myself it was merely the force of water striking old wood, a part of me sensed something more deliberate beneath it, as if the house was tuning itself to the rain's frequency, syncing with it, breathing in time with it. The swamp beyond the window sprawled outward in endless, dark layers, the water reflecting no light, the trees bowing as though weighed down by secrets too old to name, and somewhere far off, through the thick curtain of rain, I thought I heard a faint, heavy thud, like the sound of a large animal stepping onto a submerged log, a sound that resonated with an unsettling familiarity deep within my chest even though I could not remember ever hearing anything like it before. The walkway outside creaked again, but this time with a cadence that made the skin along my arms tighten, slow, deliberate, step-like pressure that moved from one end of the house to the other without the uneven rhythm of a person's gait, more like the shifting of something heavier, something that distributed weight differently, dragging rather than walking. Though I told myself it was only the wind or the settling of old wood, still, the Boards continued to creak long after the rain masked all other sound, and each groan moved with such peculiar intention that I found myself standing perfectly still in the center of the room, listening, counting, feeling the vibration of each shift beneath my feet, and the unnerving truth settled in slowly. Whatever was moving outside was circling the house, following the line of the walkway in a pattern too slow to be human, too heavy to be a raccoon or stray dog, yet too deliberate to be explained away by weather. The owner's warning about the bedroom shutter stabbed through my mind again, though I had not yet entered the room, and the unease coiled tighter when I realized the rain striking that side of the house made a different sound entirely, a harder, denser impact, as though something on that wall resisted the rain's touch more than the others, as if the house itself was reinforcing that section with a kind of instinctive tension. I inhaled deeply, the air thick with humidity and the scent of long-saturated wood, and walked into the small hallway that led to the bedroom, feeling the boards beneath me flex with an unfamiliar weight distribution, as though the house was adjusting itself to accommodate me, learning the pattern of my steps the same way it seemed to learn the rhythm of the storm. When I reached the bedroom doorway, I paused, because the air here felt different, denser, colder, almost metallic in the way cave air sometimes feels when you descend too far from daylight, and the shutter on the far wall hung open exactly as the owner instructed, letting the rain-laden air drift through the narrow slats, carrying with it the faint, steady sound of water hitting something solid just beyond the walkway, a sound that was not wood, not mud, not foliage, but something else entirely, something with a mass and density that made each impact resonate through the shutter frame like a heartbeat. The room itself was sparsely furnished, a bed, a desk, a dresser warped by moisture, but the shadows clung more tightly here, gathering in the corners as though reluctant to part from the walls, and the floor beneath the bed seemed subtly elevated, as though something beneath the room pushed upward ever so slightly in response to the continued rain. I took a step forward and the air grew colder, almost sharply so, and the rain's rhythm changed subtly, shifting into a softer, more complex pattern that made the tiny hairs on my arms lift with an instinctual awareness that the storm was not merely weather but a kind of communication, a language the house understood intimately. The walkway outside groaned again, heavier this time, and the sound traveled along the wall in a slow arc, as though something dragged its weight around the perimeter, and I felt a faint tremor pass through the floorboards beneath me in perfect sync with the movement, and the sensation left me with the unsettling certainty that whatever was circling the house was not just moving, it was listening, memorizing the outline of the structure, the placement of the windows, the pattern of my footsteps, learning the shape of the space it intended to inhabit or enter or claim. I stepped closer to the open shutter, the rain-soaked air settling around my shoulders like a cold shawl, and when I leaned slightly toward the slats, the sound from outside deepened, no longer a thud but something more like the heavy, wet impact of dense flesh meeting wood, and though I tried to rationalize it as a branch, a log, debris from the swamp stirred by the storm, some ancient instinct coiled in. The marrow of my bones told me none of those explanations fit, that what moved outside the shutter was not the careless flotsam of the bayou but something that moved with intention, reacting to the presence of the open window the same way the house seemed to react to the rain. The storm thickened again, sheets of water slipping across the shutters in waves that made the walls vibrate ever so slightly, and as I stood in the gloom of that bedroom, the air cold against my skin, the floor trembling faintly beneath the weight of something circling in the rain, I felt, with a clarity that silenced every other thought, that I had stepped into a place that did not differentiate between the living and the listening, a place where the boundaries between house and storm and thing lurking in the rain were not fixed but fluid, shifting with the same slow inevitability as the rising water beneath the pilings. And in the midst of that realization a new sound emerged, a soft, heavy exhale from somewhere beneath the floorboards, a damp breath that did not belong to me or the house but to something waiting for night to deepen, something patient enough to let the rain do the talking on its behalf. The first night in the Bayou house unfolded with a slowness so heavy it felt almost intentional, as though time itself thickened the moment the sun dropped behind the moss-draped trees, and by the time I left the bedroom and returned to the narrow main room, the rain had intensified into a constant, pulsing curtain that pressed steadily against the walls in a rhythm that reminded me unsettlingly of fingers drumming on a table, a kind of coded anticipation that seeped into the floorboards, crept beneath the furniture, and pooled in the corners of the ceiling like humidity made sentient, and I found myself moving through the house with the reluctant caution of someone exploring the interior of a sleeping animal rather than a structure made of wood and nails. The light bulbs overhead glowed with a weak, yellowish haze, their filaments trembling with every rumble of distant thunder, and even though the electricity remained steady, the shadows behaved strangely, appearing to lengthen. Without any change in the angle of the light, stretching subtly down the walls and across the warped wooden floor in slow, creeping motions that felt less like normal shadow behavior and more like an unconscious adjusting of posture, as though the darkness sought a better vantage point from which to listen. I told myself repeatedly that the sensation of the house listening was a projection, a side effect of exhaustion, the oppressive humidity, the claustrophobic isolation of the swamp, but the boards beneath my feet continued to flex with an uncanny sensitivity to even the slightest shift in weight, responding not randomly but precisely, almost intelligently, the way an animal tightens or loosens its muscles depending on where it is touched, and the longer I walked, the more I felt the floor learning me, memorizing the pressure of each step, the distribution of my weight on my heels and arches, the rhythm of my pace, adjusting itself beneath me as if to anticipate where I would step. Next, outside, something moved again along the elevated walkway, and the sound was so distinct, so unquestionably physical, that it cut through the continuous rainfall like a blade slicing through cloth. Slow, deliberate footfalls that were too heavy to belong to any small animal yet too controlled to be the chaotic scramble of a boar or raccoon, footfalls that landed with a dull thump followed by a faint, dragging scrape, as though whatever moved carried more mass than its legs were designed to bear, and each step made the pilings of the house tremble in a way that vibrated up through the floorboards and into my ankles, sending a cold pulse through my bones that made the hair on my arms stand up. I stepped closer to the window, careful not to get too near the shuttered opening in the bedroom, and pressed my fingertips to the glass, feeling it tremble ever so slightly with each impact from the walkway outside. And when the rain momentarily shifted in direction, I caught the faintest glimpse of movement, a dark, punched shape gliding past the edge of the porch light, too obscured by the downpour to identify but possessed of a mass that disturbed the walkway boards with a weight that felt almost human, except not quite, for the rhythm of the steps had an uneven cadence that no human gait would ever naturally adopt, a slow dragging of weight punctuated by periods of stillness that felt like listening pauses, moments in which the thing outside seemed to orient itself to the interior sounds of the house. I moved away from the window and stood in the center of the room, listening so intently that the sound of my own breathing became intrusive, too loud, too rhythmic, too alive in a house where everything else moved with the quiet patience of a creature accustomed to darkness, and that was when I realized the floorboards beneath me were no longer merely flexing, they were breathing, expanding and contracting with a slow, subtle rise and fall that matched neither the storm nor my breath but some deeper pulse rooted in the swamp itself, a pulse that made the house feel less like timber and nails and more like vertebrae, like ribs, like the internal structure of something living and enormous. A thick drop of rainwater fell from the ceiling beam above me, landing with a heavy plop that resonated through the floor in a vibration far too strong for a single droplet, and when I looked up, I saw that the dampness on the ceiling was not following the directional logic of ordinary leakage but instead tracing sinuous paths, thin rivulets that crawled along the grain of the wood, as though guided by an unseen hand, converging at a spot directly above where I stood before dripping down in a single line, a line that felt almost intentional in the way it targeted the center of the room. The walls, too, were reacting, the seams between the boards swelling and contracting like the inhalation and exhalation of lungs, and when thunder rolled across the swamp, the entire house shivered, not from fear or instability, but from anticipation, like a creature bracing for contact. The footsteps outside circled again, slower this time, more methodical, the weight shifting from one end of the walkway to the other with the same deliberate patience as a predator stalking prey it knows cannot escape, and the rain only intensified the effect, each droplet carrying its own unique tone as it struck the roof, the shutters, the moss, layering sound upon sound until the storm resembled a whispered conversation carried out in a language not meant for human comprehension, a language that the house responded to with unmistakable familiarity, as though the rain were instructing it, coaxing it, guiding it through an old ritual performed countless times before. I tried to distract myself by unpacking, setting my notebooks and blueprint cases on the desk, but even mundane actions felt distorted in the atmosphere of the house, as though the simple act of opening a drawer sent ripples through the floor that extended outward, moving through the walkway, across the pilings, into the swamped water below, and I could feel, without knowing how, that the thing walking outside recognized each sound, cataloged it, understood it as part of the house's shifting anatomy. When I opened the bedroom door again, intending only to set down a lamp, the air in the room seemed to thicken instantly, a cold, damp heaviness clinging to my arms like invisible vines, and the rain through the open shutter produced a sound so distinct, so deep, that I froze in place, a heavy, wet impact against the walkway just outside the slats, the sound of dense flesh meeting soaked wood in a slow, deliberate press, followed by a second impact, then a third, each one vibrating through the shutter frame in a pattern that felt unmistakably like knocking, except not the knocking of knuckles or fists but of something wider and harder, something with mass behind it, something that struck the boards not to request entry but to confirm my presence. I stepped back slowly, the air in the bedroom dropping several degrees as the knocking continued, each strike spaced far enough apart to create a rhythm that suggested patience rather than urgency, and the house responded with a subtle groan that began deep in the pilings and spread upward like a yawn through the support beams, the walls expanding outward for a moment before contracting again, the entire structure shifting as if adjusting its posture in response to the thing outside. The knocking ceased, but the silence that followed was worse, because the absence of movement made the rain sound sharper, clearer, more articulate, and in that clarity I could hear patterns, repeating sequences of impacts, subtle shifts in intensity, rhythms too structured to be random, like coded signals exchanged between the storm and the house, and the longer I listened, the more those patterns felt directed at me, not in an accusatory way but in a curious, investigative way, as though the rain and the house were comparing notes about the new arrival, measuring my weight, my breath, my presence, deciding how I fit into the architecture of their shared understanding. I closed the bedroom door and leaned against it, feeling the wood vibrate faintly against my back as the house seemed to whisper beneath the roar of the storm, its boards moving in tiny, almost imperceptible shifts, each one aligning itself to my presence as though preparing for something, and in that moment a realization as cold as swamp water slid through me. The owner's warning about leaving the shutter open had nothing to do with airflow or mold or structural strain. It had to do with whatever moved along the walkway, whatever knew the house and the house knew in return, whatever listened to the rain with the same attention the house did, because the shutter was not simply a window, it was a threshold, a point of exchange between two states of existence, and if I closed it, something in the delicate balance between house, rain, and whatever circled outside would shift in a way that could not be undone. The thought lodged itself deep in my mind as the knocking resumed. Once more, softer this time, almost like an invitation, and as I stood there in the dim yellow glow of the trembling light bulb, listening to the weight of something enormous and patient tracing the same circular path around the house again and again, I felt the house respond beneath my feet with an almost tender exhale, a sigh of wood and water and time, and I knew, with a certainty that tightened slowly around my ribs, that the house did not merely listen to the rain, it waited for it, depended on it, grew sharper and more attuned with each drop that struck its walls, and now that I had entered, it was listening to me too, learning me in the same slow, careful way it learned the storm, and whatever waited outside was doing the same, their intentions intertwining like the roots of old cypress trees deep beneath the waterline, preparing for a moment the house already understood but I had not yet begun to perceive. The third hour of the storm deepened into something heavier, thicker, so saturated with sound and movement that it felt as though the entire bayou were rising around the house in slow increments, each raindrop adding weight to the air until the atmosphere pressed against my skin like a second, damp hide, and by the time I returned to the bedroom doorway, something in the house had shifted again, not loudly or violently, but subtly, the way an animal adjusts its position without drawing attention. Its silence disturbed only by the soft expansion of ribs and the slow settling of muscle, and I sensed that whatever balance existed between the house, the rain, and the thing circling outside had stretched taut enough that the smallest disruption would send it recoiling like a snapped branch. Stepping into the bedroom felt like wading into a cold current, the temperature dropping several degrees the moment my foot crossed the threshold, the floorboard beneath it sinking just slightly lower than those in the hallway as if weighed down by something beneath it, and though I tried to tell myself it was only the weakening of old wood, there was a deliberateness to the way it dipped, a slow resistance like the wooden bones of the house recognizing my presence and shifting to accommodate it, or to warn me. The open shutter rattled in the wind, but not with the chaotic clatter of random gusts. Its movements were rhythmic, pulsing, opening by fractions and then settling back into place with a soft, controlled flex, as though it were breathing in the rain, inhaling the storm with the hunger of something starved from moisture and sound, and the curtains beside it swayed not in reaction to wind but to the subtle back and forth sway of the shutter itself, creating the illusion that something stood just beyond the slats, leaning in, testing the boundary with slow, patient breaths. The walkway throbbed again beneath the weight of the unseen thing that continued its steady circuit around the house, each heavy step and dragging scrape producing a vibration that traveled up the wooden pilings like a voice traveling through a long hollow bone, and the more I listened, the more certain I became that the thing outside was not merely pacing, it was waiting, timing its movements to the rhythm of the rain, listening for shifts in my own position, responding to the subtle creaks of the floorboards beneath me, as though gauging my exact location, memorizing the distance between itself and the open shutter. The rain thickened into long sheets, its sound shifting into something more like a sustained whisper, countless individual impacts merging into a single continuous rush that seemed less like weather and more like speech, muffled, indecipherable, but undeniably articulate in a way I could feel but not understand, an atmospheric language that pressed into the walls and seeped down through the roof beams. And the house absorbed it greedily, its boards trembling with each prolonged exhale of the storm. It seems widening then contracting as if translating the rainfall into a rhythm it had known for decades. A thin strand of water slid down the interior wall, moving sideways rather than down as though following some internal grain or buried channel carved into the wood long before the house ever existed in this form, and when I traced the line with my eyes, I saw that it converged at a point directly beneath the open shutter, a dark knot of wood swollen with moisture, pulsing faintly like a weak heartbeat beneath a layer of flesh. And in that pulse I recognized something disturbingly familiar, an echo of the same slow, heavy rhythm I had felt earlier under the walkway when the unseen thing moved. Outside, the footsteps halted directly beneath the shutter, close enough that I could feel the vibration of its presence through the floorboards, and then a new sound joined the storm, a low, wet exhale with the density of air forced through deep water, an exhale that pushed a thin gust of cold, humid breath through the slats and across my face, carrying with it a scent that was not swamp water nor rot nor mud but something mineral and old, like stone pulled from a river's deepest point, and the feeling of that breath on my skin made my chest tighten with an instinct that felt older than fear itself, a deep animal knowing that whatever stood outside was aware of me, was adjusting itself to the specific outline of my existence, was waiting for a mistake. I backed away from the shutter as slowly as I could, careful not to let the floorboard groan beneath my weight, but the house responded to even the smallest shift, its framework tightening around me with a creaking sigh that seemed to betray my movement to the thing outside, and the moment that sigh escaped, the heavy knocking resumed, 3 slow impacts, one after another, so dense and deliberate that the shutter frame trembled beneath them, and the house trembled too, not in weakness but in recognition, as though it had been expecting this, as though it understood the sequence of knocks the same way it understood the rainfall. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it began, but the absence of the sound was far worse, the silence so complete it reminded me of the quiet that follows the moment lightning finds a tree, a vacuum of anticipation where the world seems to draw breath before releasing something catastrophic, and in that vacuum I heard, faintly, the shifting of something massive on the walkway, not stepping but repositioning, aligning its weight to place itself directly in front of the shutter, the slats bowing inward with the pressure of its presence. And for the first time since arriving, I realized exactly what the owner's warning meant. The shutter was not meant to keep something out, it was meant to keep something balanced, to maintain a fragile equilibrium between what belonged outside and what the house allowed to come inside, and by leaving it open, I was participating, knowingly or not, in a ritual the house had been performing with the rain for years. Thunder rolled across the swamp, low and far away, but the vibration it produced seemed to pulse through the thing outside, as if the storm were communicating with it, activating it, urging it, and when the rain shifted into a slightly different cadence, softer for a moment, the shutter swung inward by half an inch, not enough to seem intentional yet not random enough to dismiss, and the cold breath of the storm deepened within the room, brushing against my shirt, raising gooseflesh across my arms. There was a moment, long, stretched thin like the surface of deep water, where everything aligned, the rain, the breath, the shutter, The footsteps, the shifting floor beneath my heels, the trembling walls, and in that alignment I felt the house anticipating something from me, not out of malice but out of something closer to longing, as though I were an element missing from a cycle older than my lifetime. I stepped back until my spine pressed into the hallway frame, and the house reacted. Instantly, its floor stretching subtly beneath my weight as though it were adjusting to a new center of gravity, and at that exact moment the knocking returned, softer now, almost tender, each impact brushing against the shutter like a touch rather than a demand, and the intimacy of the sound unsettled me more than the force of the earlier knocks, because there was something pleading in it, something that felt like an invitation issued from a place that did not understand refusal, the air inside. The house thickened even more, so humid it felt like inhaling warm fog, and I could feel the condensation forming on my skin as though the house were exhaling onto me, warming me, mapping the shape of my body the way it mapped the rainfall, tracing each surface and edge in preparation for something I did not want to name. The sound beneath the floor, the soft, heavy inhalation I had heard earlier, grew louder, closer, almost thoughtful, and with each breath it released, the boards beneath the bed lifted by increments too small to see but large enough to feel in the soles of my feet, a swelling that felt like the body of some submerged creature rising slowly toward the surface, and I realized with a tightening in my throat that the thing outside was not the only thing responding to the rain, that something else beneath the house, something older and denser and infinitely patient, was aligning itself as well. My pulse thundered in my ears, but even that sound felt swallowed, absorbed by the walls. Translated into vibrations, the house passed downward into the swamp, and in the midst of that heavy, suffocating exchange, a sudden gust of wind struck the side of the house, lifting the shutter half an inch more, just enough for the slats to angle differently, letting in a thin beam of shifting, rain-filtered moonlight, and in that momentary illumination I saw, through the narrow gap, something move on the walkway, a broad, dark shape, slick with rain, its outline sloping and uneven, rising and falling as though composed of segments or layered plates, and though the rain distorted its form, I knew instantly that whatever it was had no business being upright, no business walking, no business existing anywhere above the surface of the water, and when it shifted its weight and pressed something against the shutter again, a thick, hardened mass that struck with a dull, resonant impact, the slats bowed inward with such pressure that I could see the moisture beating along their edges as though squeezed from the wood by force. Everything inside me screamed to slam the shutter closed, to seal it shut, to shut out the shape and the sound and the breath, but something deeper, some instinct that felt not mine but borrowed from the house, held me still, paralyzing my limbs with the awful knowledge that closing the shutter would not solve anything. It would break something delicate and ancient, something the house needed to survive the storm, and breaking it would not stop what waited outside but invite it to find another way in, a way not meant for human boundaries. So I stood there, back pressed to the frame, chest rising in shallow panicked breaths, while the thing outside leaned closer, its presence pressing into the room like an unseen tide, and the house adjusted its walls, its floors, its very breath to match the rhythm of the storm, preparing itself for something I could feel but not yet understand. And in that slow, suffocating moment I realized the truth the owner never spoke aloud. The shutter was not to remain open for me, it was to remain open for whatever I was about to become. The storm reached a depth of intensity one had never experienced, not in any city, not in any rural farm town, not in any forest cabin or mountain lodge or place touched by ordinary weather, because this was not the familiar violence of thunderstorms cracking open the sky but something slower, heavier, older, a kind of rain that seemed to remember itself, layering each droplet upon the last until the air grew so waterlogged it felt like breathing through a soaked cloth, and as the rainfall deepened into a nearly solid sheet of sound, the house responded with a strange, tremulous awareness, the walls expanding on long inhalations, the floor settling with soft, tremoring exhales, the wood shifting not randomly but rhythmically in a manner that suggested it was aligning itself to the storm the way a body aligns itself to sleep. And in that trembling synchronicity I felt myself becoming part of the cycle without moving, as though simply existing inside the house meant being absorbed into its humid logic. The creature on the walkway continued its slow, deliberate movements, dragging its weight around the perimeter in circles so perfect and so consistent that the rhythm began to infect the pacing of my heartbeat, and the more I listened to that looping pattern, the more my sense of time began to dissolve, seconds slipping backward and forward like water sliding along the edge of a levee. until I could no longer tell whether minutes or hours had passed since I first heard it. Stop beneath the shutter. The shutter itself had become a living hinge, bowing inward with each heavy impact, flexing outward in the brief pauses between them, and the effect created a pulsing visual distortion in the dimness of the room, the slats shifting position in such a slow oscillation that it felt almost like the blinking of an eye struggling to stay open through a long dream, and every time those slats parted just slightly, the room filled with the smell of the creature outside, mineral. Rich, waterlogged, stagnant and ancient, the scent of layers of time compressed beneath the swamp and rising only when something disturbed them. Beneath my feet, the swelling of the floorboards had become steady, a gentle upward pressure pressing through the wood as though something beneath the house were pushing slowly upward, adjusting me into place, raising the boards by fractions of an inch at a time, careful not to jar me but insistent enough that I could no longer dismiss it as simple. Warping were the movement of trapped air, and the realization that there were two forces, one outside, one beneath, converging on a single point in this room made the air thicken so completely that I had to swallow in shallow motions, my throat constricting with each attempt to inhale. The walls around me were damp now, dripping in thin, meandering trails that behaved like living veins carrying water inward towards some unseen organ at the center of the house, and each droplet hit the floor with a weight far greater than water should have, the impact echoing in my knees, my ribs, the base of my skull, until I felt as though the house were using the storm to translate something, to articulate a message through drops and creaks and atmospheric pressure. Far below the pilings, deep beneath the waterline in the mud-thick belly of the swamp, something stirred with a long, dragging movement, a shift so enormous that the water surrounding the house seemed to inhale, pulling inward before expanding outward in a soft swell that rocked the entire structure like a cradle, and for a moment I saw the edges of the walls move, not bending, not breaking, but flexing with a fluid elasticity that suggested the house was not resisting the movement but embracing it, sinking its frame to the rhythm of whatever rose beneath it. I stepped backward without intending to, my heel brushing against the hall threshold, and the floor responded instantly, the boards beneath me sinking with a slow, deliberate exhalation, pushing me forward again, nudging me a fraction of an inch closer to the center of the room, and the intent behind the motion was so gentle, so almost parental, that it frightened me more than any aggressive shift could have, because there was intelligence and gentleness, a kind of careful placement that suggested I was being moved according to a plan the house had known long before I ever set foot inside it. The footsteps on the walkway paused once more directly outside the shutter, and for a long moment the storm seemed to hush ever so slightly, the rain thinning just enough that the sound of the creature's breath, deep, watery, bubbling with the density of silt, became the dominant sound in the room, and that breath pressed through the slats, sliding across the floor in cold, damp currents that reached my ankles and curled around my calves like tendrils of subterranean air rising from a flooded cave. My pulse began to race, not in panic but in some deeper, stranger rhythm that felt too synchronized with the environment, as though my heart were matching the tempo of the rain, of the house, of the thing outside, and for one horrifying second I felt myself drifting out of alignment with my own body, my sense of self smearing at the edges like ink bleeding into wet paper, and I understood that the house was not simply listening to the rain, it was listening through me, using me as another surface to catch the storm's message, to interpret it, to translate it. The shutter bowed inward again, and this time the slats flexed wide enough for a thin shard of lightning-lit air to spill into the room, illuminating a single slick, dark curve of the creature's body pressed against the wood, its surface glistening with rain and something else, something thicker and more reflective, and though the flash lasted only an instant, it was enough for me to see that the thing outside had not been walking in circles because it was trapped, but because it was waiting for the precise moment when the shutter's angle, the rainfall's rhythm, and the house's position aligned perfectly. A convergence of conditions as old as the swamp itself. Beneath the floor, the swelling reached its highest point yet, lifting the boards beneath my feet in a slow, ceremonial rise, and in that upward motion I felt something like a breath being drawn from deep underground, a vast inhalation taken through the house's pilings, traveling up the walls, through the beams, into the ceiling, and then settling around me in a way that made my bones vibrate with a strange, mournful resonance. The rain intensified once more, but this time the sound was no longer chaotic. Each droplet landed with the same perfect spacing and weight as the last, forming a pattern so exact it felt choreographed, a ritualistic drumming that struck the roof, The shutters, the walkway, the water below, as though the entire bayou had entered a kind of trance, responding to some signal the storm had carried down from the sky. The walls contracted inward, just slightly, but enough that I felt them graze the edges of my awareness, the room narrowing until even the air felt shaped around me like a mold, and in that constricting space came a sound I had not heard before, a low, resonant hum rising from the deepest part of the house, vibrating through the floor in concentric pulses, each one aligning my heartbeat closer to it, and though I tried to step away from the center of the room, my legs refused to obey, my muscles softening as though the air had seeped into the tissue, turning every movement into a slow, drifting sway. The shutter bowed inward once more, further than before, the wood groaning under the pressure of whatever leaned against it, and for the first time the slats parted wide enough for me to see not the creature's body, not its slick surface, but something else behind it, the water of the bayou rising up the pilings in unnatural, vertical sheets, climbing like a living thing rather than flowing, the surface tension forming long, trembling tendrils that reached toward the window frame. As though drawn to the breath of the storm inside, the floor beneath the bed swelled again, and this time the movement was accompanied by a deep, creaking resonance that felt unmistakably like the slow opening of a door, not a door in the house, not a door I could see, but a threshold beneath the structure, a wide, heavy entrance in the mud or stone opening with the patience of something that has been closed for a very long time. The rain shifted its rhythm again, softening for a moment, allowing the heavy, dragging exhale of the thing outside to fill the room, and that breath carried with it a vibration that I felt in the hollow spaces between my ribs, a resonance that made my chest tighten and my pulse sink involuntarily with the sound, and in that involuntary synchronization I understood the reason the shutter must remain open. The house was not protecting me from the thing outside, the house was aligning me with it, tuning me to the same frequency, preparing me for a moment when the storm, the creature, and the structure itself would overlap in a single, perfectly balanced breath. The floorboards sank beneath me once more, then rose again, repeating the motion like a slow inhalation, and as the boards lifted, I felt the shape beneath them, large, serpentine, impossibly dense, press upward in a subtle, anticipatory gesture, and the pressure carried with it a sense of recognition so profound, so intimate, that it made my vision blur with the knowledge I was not merely being observed, but being chosen. The rain struck the roof with a new ferocity, the sound no longer resembling water but something closer to hands, countless hands tapping on the surface in rhythmic agreement, and the house trembled under the sheer density of the message, absorbing it, processing it, and finally releasing a single long exhale through its walls, a gust of warm, damp air that wrapped around me with a strange finality. The shutter bowed inward one last time, the creature outside shifting with the heavy certainty of something that had waited long enough, and in the suffocating, rain-thick darkness of that room, I realized with absolute clarity that the house had not been listening to the rain at all, it had been listening through it, waiting for a signal older than its beams, older than the swamp, older than the land that held them both, and now that the signal had arrived, there was only one thing left for it to do. It began to call me by reshaping the air, pulling the breath from my lungs, aligning my pulse with the creature's, turning my body into the final open shutter through which something ancient could finally step. The moment the house exhaled that long, deliberate breath, warm, damp, and heavy enough to cling to my skin like a second layer of humidity, the rain outside seemed to pause in midair, not in the literal sense, not with any visible suspension of droplets, but in the perceptual way that sound can halt time, the storm's roar thinning just enough that the pattern of its fall shifted from chaos into structure. And that structure revealed itself not through clarity but through alignment, a slow convergence of cadence and pressure and pulsing atmosphere that marked the arrival of the moment the house had been preparing for since before I stepped foot on the walkway, since before the first drop of the storm touched the roof, perhaps even since before the first plank of wood was nailed into place on these pilings deep in the swamp. Standing in the center of the bedroom with the shutter bowed inward by the weight of the creature outside, I felt the house lifting and lowering in long, tidal motions, each rise and fall shifting me into a new angle, a new posture, a new point in the invisible geometry that bound the house to the storm and the storm to the thing beneath the pilings, and in those slow adjustments I realized the house was no longer reacting to the rain but to me, as though calibrating my breath, my heartbeat, my stance to match the pattern carved into the surrounding swamp by centuries of storms that had taught the house how to listen. The floorboards beneath my Feet trembled with a gentle but insistent rhythm, rising in small, controlled pulses that reminded me of a large animal nudging another into place, positioning me for something I could sense only in a distant, subterranean way, and the awareness that I was being arranged, shaped, prepared, settled into a role I had not chosen, made the air tighten in my throat until each breath scraped like thick fog against stone. Outside, the creature pressed its weight more firmly against the shutter, the wood bending inward with a slow, groaning resilience that sounded less like a struggle to hold firm and more like a greeting, the slats widening just enough for faint, diffused moonlight to glimmer off the slick, shifting surface of whatever stood on the walkway, and though the rain still obscured its full form, the movement of that wet, heavy mass revealed something serpentine in its size, something vertebral in its slow curvature, something impossibly ancient in the way its weight redistributed through the planks of the walkway as though remembering their shape from long ago. Beneath the house, deep in the wet soil and drowned roots, the slow upward pressure of the thing rising from below intensified, pressing against the beams with a steady strength that made the entire frame of the house shudder from below rather than above, and as the boards beneath me rose once more in a subtle, deliberate swell, I felt a strange sensation blooming deep within my ribs, a slow loosening, as though the house's breath were moving through me rather than around me, hollowing out a space inside my chest that pulsed in time with the storm's rhythm. The rain, which had been falling in dense, overlapping sheets, suddenly broke into two distinct layers of sound, the first a steady surface rhythm against the roof, the second a deeper, more resonant impact against the walkway and pilings, and the overlapping patterns formed a kind of drumbeat so intricate it seemed impossible that it could be produced by chance, and in that moment I understood with a clarity that chilled me more than any gust of wind ever could. The rain was not simply falling, it was speaking, tapping out a message the house had always been able to hear but that I was only now beginning to perceive in the bones behind my teeth. The room grew darker though the storm did not, the walls seeming to draw inward as if pulling the shadows closer to conceal the final transformation taking place inside the house, and the ceiling sagged with a low, groaning heaviness that suggested it too had begun to breathe, inhaling deeply through cracks that had never existed before tonight, exhaling through the shifting seams of the plaster with a thick, swamp-warm breath that tasted faintly of minerals and soil. The shutter bowed inward again, further this time, and the gap between the slats widened enough for a cold gust of rain-soaked air to strike my face, carrying with it an intimacy so complete that I felt, in an instinctive and ancient part of myself, that the creature outside was not trying to enter the house, it was trying to invite me out, drawing me toward the threshold the way deep water pulls at the ankles of anyone standing too close to its edge, and as that cold breath slid across my skin, the floor beneath me shivered in a way that made my knees buckle slightly, not from fear but from the sudden realization that my weight distribution had changed, that the house had slowly shifted me into the center of a pattern I could not see but could feel in the marrow of my bones. The walls around me expanded once more, and as they contracted again, the contraction carried with it a soft, rumbling vibration that did not originate from wood or nails but from something deeper, something beneath the pilings, something rising with the steady certainty of a force that had been waiting for its moment across countless seasons. The shutter swung inward another fraction of an inch, the wood finally failing under the weight of the creature's slow, patient approach, and the room filled with a sound I had only heard in fragmented form before, a heavy, wet, dragging inhale that vibrated through the slats and across the wooden floor with the density of something vast drawing its first full breath of the night, and in that sound I felt the faintest echo of my own breath sinking with it, aligning to it, matching its pace with a precision that should not have been possible. The lightning outside illuminated the room in a brief, pale flash, and in that moment I understood the final piece of the pattern. The house had not been preparing to protect me from the creature, nor had it been preparing to allow the creature in. It had been preparing me to take my place in the cycle, conditioning my body and breath and awareness so that the house could release one voice and accept another, and the recognition of that truth landed with the heavy, irreversible certainty of a stone sinking through deep water. The upward pressure beneath the floorboards intensified and then collapsed in a long, slow exhale, the boards sinking back down into place as though something enormous beneath the house had finally settled into a new position, and in that sinking motion I felt my own body shift with it, not downward but outward, my sense of self expanding beyond the limits of my skin, connecting to the trembling walls, to the breathing shutter, to the soaked air swirling through the slats. until the boundaries between myself and the house grew thin enough that the storm's voice echoed through my ribs with the same fidelity as it echoed through the wooden beams overhead. The creature on the walkway shifted again, but this time the movement carried no weight of threat, no suggestion of intrusion, only expectation, the patient anticipation of something joining it, something finishing what had already been set into motion. And as the shutter widened with another groaning bow, the house lifted its walls in a long inhalation and released a final, warm exhale that carried my last independent breath with it, dispersing it into the humid air as easily as fog dissolving into dawn. The floorboards hardened beneath my feet, taking on a density and stillness that did not belong to wood but to something older, something shaped by water and time. And though my legs remained upright, I felt no need to move, no space between action and consequence, only a slow settling of awareness as my body aligned perfectly with the house's final exhale. And as the storm reached its peak outside, the creature pressed one last heavy touch against the shutter, which no longer resisted but yielded gently with a soft, wet crack, opening just enough for the cool breath of the bayou to slide into the room and settle around me like a cloak. The walls shivered, the ceiling bowed, the floor breathed, and in that final synchronized motion the house received the storm's message, accepted it, and released its answer through me, not through words but through the shift in my chest, the soft spreading of awareness that reached outward along the walkway and into the rain-soaked night. And when I finally stepped forward, it was not with the tentative hesitation of a man but with the slow, heavy certainty of something that had learned the shape of the walkway long before it learned the shape of its own skin. Outside, the rain greeted me with the intimacy of a long-forgotten memory, and the house creaked in a low, satisfied exhale behind me, settling into the quiet, listening posture of a structure that had completed its part in the ritual and now waited for the next storm to teach it another shape. The creature on the walkway shifted aside with the patience of something ancient granting passage to something newly born, and as I moved past it, my weight landing with a perfect, familiar thud on the soaked wood, I felt the walkway tremble, not in fear or strain but in recognition, the boards adjusting to my mass with the ease of long acquaintance, and in that trembling welcome I understood the truth with a calmness too deep to belong to the man who first entered the house. I was no longer the visitor who came to finish a project. I was the one the house had shaped to take its voice, the one who would walk the walkway through every storm, tracing the same slow, deliberate path around the stilted structure, listening as the rain told the house what to become next. And somewhere deep beneath the pilings, the thing that rose from the swamp settled into the comforting certainty that the threshold had been filled again, and the cycle would continue undisturbed. By morning, the storm would end, the shutters would be dry, and the house would return to its stillness. But the walkway would remember the weight of the night and the pattern of footsteps that now belonged to me alone, footsteps that would echo in long, looping circuits through every future storm, because the house had listened to the rain, learned from it, and finally spoken back using the only voice it needed, mine. And now, as the last story fades into whatever quiet corner of your mind still knows the difference between the waking hours and the dark stretches in between them, I want you to stay just a moment longer, there in that soft hum of the night, in that breathless place where the world feels thinner and the hours feel heavier, as though something old and patient is listening from the other side of the dark. These 5 stories, whispers of deserted highways, forgotten cabins, solitary lights, breathing houses, and the long empty spaces where human footsteps don't quite belong, were never really about the monsters themselves, not the ones that circle the porch or wait below rotten floorboards or stand in the desert staring with your own borrowed face, but about the strange truth that sometimes the places we think we pass through quietly have been waiting for us longer than we realize, studying us in small gestures, learning the rhythm of our breath, listening in ways that no animal or person ever has. And sometimes, when the timing is just right and the night grows just deep enough, those places speak back. So if you're listening now in a dark room, or in your car on a lonely road, or in the quiet half-sleep that always comes just before dreams begin to take shape, let the echo of these stories settle gently around you like the last drift of fog across an empty field, but don't cling to them too tightly, because the night never needs much help finding its way inside your thoughts once it knows the sound of your pulse. Take a slow breath, let your shoulders fall, let the quiet deepen, and remember that the world is full of forgotten corners, where the air shifts strangely, where doorframes seem to listen, where the rain falls in patterns too exact to be weather, where old roads do not lead where they should. And if you ever find yourself in one of those places, some quiet cabin, some abandoned station, some crooked house raised above dark water. Pause for a moment before you step inside and pay attention to what the silence is doing, because silence with weight is never empty, and silence that listens is never truly silent at all. For now, though, you've done your part. You've stayed with me through every strange mile and every heavy footstep and every breath of wind that felt just a little too close, and the night, whatever pieces of it have been listening, is satisfied. Wherever you are, I hope your room feels a little warmer now, your blankets a little heavier, your lights a little softer. Sleep, if you can, drift, if you dare, and if something in the dark shifts its weight just slightly on the other side of your wall, don't worry too much, it's probably just the night listening back.